Hey guys, tonight we drift into the distant waters off the Philippine archipelago, under the shimmer of a moonlit sky. How did the Filipinos navigate the sea? The answer is using shells, which might sound strange, but let's jump into what it was like. The air is warm, dense with the salt of centuries, and the waves lap quietly against the hull of a small outrigger canoe carved from memory, as much as from wood. In the pre-colonial Philippines, long before GPS, compasses, or even written charts entered these waters, Filipino sailors navigated thousands of islands using tools few outside their world could decipher. Among them, strange objects that resembled woven riddles, shell maps. These were not maps in the European sense. No borders, no scale bars, no north arrows. Instead, these tactile creations encoded currents, reefs, and star positions using a blend of shells, string, and intricate intuition. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere coastal or landlocked, drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The coastal communities of the Philippines, Tagbanwa, Samar-Bajay, Tausug, and others, depended on seafaring, not merely for trade or migration, but for identity. The sea was livelihood, spirit, and archive. Shell maps played a role in preserving that identity, though they were almost entirely invisible to the colonial gaze. They were rarely written about, hardly preserved in museums, and often dismissed as folklore, yet they guided real journeys across real danger. Filipino navigators used oceanic knowledge accumulated over generations and committed entirely to memory. They didn't think in terms of nautical miles, but of stories. A sailor didn't turn east for 5 kilometers. He steered left at the shoal where his grandfather survived a storm, and straight ahead toward the reef, shaped like a sleeping dog. Every landmark had a name, and every name a narrative. The result was a deeply embedded network of mnemonic wayfinding. And then there were the shell maps themselves. These weren't common across all groups, nor uniform in design. Historians still argue whether the shell maps used in the Philippines were directly influenced by Micronesian stick charts, complex navigational tools made of palm ribs and cowrie shells used in the Marshall Islands, or whether similar techniques evolved independently in maritime Southeast Asia. But fragments remain, pieces of driftwood joined by cord, seashells placed at precise nodes, geometric patterns that mimicked the rhythm of waves. These tools were both maps and memory aids. One did not consult a shell map in the middle of a journey. Instead, a sailor would trace its design beforehand, committing the currents and routes to heart. It was a learning tool, rather than a reference. In this way, it functioned like oral tradition, like epic poetry. The shell map needed to be heard or felt, repeatedly, to sink into the body. Coastal life was attuned to the rhythm of the sea. Tides were clocks, clouds were calendars, and winds were road signs. Navigation was not just observation, it was embodiment. The map was an extension of the body's own memory, where the sun rose over that jagged tree, where the fish always leapt before the storm. It was a dance between instinct and environmental literacy, a choreography rehearsed on rocking hulls under constellations that hadn't yet been renamed by colonizers. One of the most haunting features of this system is that it left few permanent traces, most of these maps being crafted from organic materials like palm, bamboo, and shell, have not survived the centuries. Their knowledge lived in people, in elders who remembered the right chant for steadying wind, or the precise hue the water turned when a coral bed approached. What little survives comes in fragments, a few maps preserved in obscure collections, scattered field notes from 20th century ethnographers, and whispered stories. Still, the atmosphere of a pre-colonial shoreline can be reconstructed, not fully but evocatively. Picture a canoe being readied by torchlight. Young sailors watching a master navigator thread coral beads onto dried vine. A shell placed not randomly, but at a precise angle. A waymarker for a submerged sandbar. The quiet hush as wind shifts, and the boat is pushed out into dark velvet water. And in that moment, with no compass, no map, no modern tool of any kind, that navigator still knows where they're going. This first glimpse into the world of Filipino shell maps challenges modern assumptions about exploration and knowledge. Navigation wasn't a product of conquest or enlightenment. In this world, it was communion. The sea was a living being, and these early sailors knew how to speak its language. Even today, remnants of that fluency remain. Not in formal academies, but in stories passed down along the shorelines, in chants sung before launching a boat, and in hands that still remember how to feel the ocean's breath through calloused palms. The shell map is spread out before them, not on paper or canvas, but in a carefully balanced lattice of sticks, strings, and shells. It looks more like a ritual object than a navigational tool, and in many ways, that's exactly what it is. Crafted from the ribs of palm fronds or slender bamboo, the frame acts as the skeleton of the sea. Curved sticks represent ocean swells, their bend and placement recording prevailing wave directions. Small cowrie shells or coral fragments are tied at intersections, some to mark islands, others to note where wave patterns break or cross in peculiar ways. This map isn't static. It doesn't try to freeze the sea in place. Instead, it captures motion, currents, wave behavior, and intersections of energy. It's less a snapshot and more a whisper of the ocean's ongoing conversation with the wind. To the untrained eye, it might seem abstract or even decorative, but for the skilled navigator, every curve and shell placement encodes years of collective knowledge. The location of a shell might signify a lagoon only accessible at high tide, or a reef that breaks boats when the monsoon hits from the southwest. The curve of a stick might replicate the average direction of swells during a particular season. It is a three-dimensional language, with the sailor as both reader and translator. What makes these shell maps especially intriguing is how they were used. They were never consulted mid-journey. These were not tools of last resort or backup plans. Instead, navigators would memorize them in advance. They would study the pattern, trace the routes with their fingers, and internalize the geography, not as shapes, but as movement. Once at sea, the maps stayed ashore. This approach relied heavily on muscle memory and mental cartography. The navigator's mind became the true map, filled with associations. When the water starts to shimmer like oil, we're nearing the outer reef, or when the wind smells faintly metallic, the volcano island lies just ahead. The shell map merely initiated the process. The ocean completed it. There's also a striking element of humility embedded in this tradition. Unlike the authoritative top-down gaze of Western cartography, which tried to dominate space from a distance, these shell maps reflected a participatory, almost egalitarian relationship with the sea. The ocean wasn't something to conquer. It was a collaborator, temperamental, often cryptic, but never mute. One curious feature of these maps is the way they appear deceptively minimalist. There are no written labels, no borders, just shells and curves. And yet some of the most skilled navigators could reportedly use them to traverse hundreds of kilometers across open sea. Stories survive of long-distance voyages between the Philippines, Micronesia, and even Palau, using maps that fit in a pouch but lived much larger in memory. Historians still debate the extent to which this specific mapping style was native to the Philippines. The Marshall Islands stick charts are far better known and more widely studied. Some argue the Filipino version was an independent innovation, another instance of maritime genius arising in isolation. Others suggest cultural exchange, pointing to ancient trade routes that connected Austronesian peoples long before European colonization. There's no consensus, but plenty of speculation. What is clear is that such knowledge systems didn't thrive in isolation. They were part of a larger web of tools and techniques, like reading cloud shadows to gauge distance to shore, or interpreting the flight path of birds to guess at nearby islands. Shell maps were just one piece of a greater navigational puzzle, in which the navigator was expected to be meteorologist, oceanographer, and sometimes even a little bit clairvoyant. Skeptics sometimes question the scientific accuracy of these tools, and while it's true that shell maps don't conform to modern standards of cartographic precision, they were never meant to. They weren't trying to describe the sea from above. They were trying to navigate it from within. This distinction is crucial. The maps functioned almost like music notation for the sea, a framework for improvisation, memory, and real-time response. One navigator's interpretation might differ slightly from another's, not because the map was wrong, but because it allowed space for intuition, experience, and variation. In this sense, no two journeys were exactly the same, even with the same shell map. Some modern ethnographers have pointed out that these maps occupy a strange space between object and performance. They aren't just artifacts, they're tools of a living tradition, and like any performance, their full meaning is only understood in the doing. Watching a skilled navigator explain a shell map is less like a geography lesson, and more like listening to a storyteller or a poet reciting verses from memory. Perhaps the most poetic truth of all is that many of these maps were destroyed, not by time, but by misunderstanding. Colonial powers often dismissed them as primitive art, or discarded them altogether, unable to see their layered complexity. What survived did so in secret, passed down through oral tradition, or hidden in the folds of ritual. In rare cases, descendants of navigators have begun reconstructing these maps using ancestral memories and a few remaining samples. Each reconstruction becomes more than just a piece of heritage. It becomes a revival of a philosophy, one that insists the sea can be known, not through domination, but through dialogue. And so the shell map remains, quiet, intricate, and astonishing, a symbol of a world where knowledge flowed not from books or screens, but from waves, wind, and the wisdom of hands. Long before the age of compasses, sextants, and GPS satellites, the seas around the Philippine archipelago were traversed with nothing but lived experience and a sense of feeling that bordered on the mystical. Filipino sailors relied on what could be called a gut instinct. But this instinct was no accident. It was refined, practiced, and handed down like sacred heirloom knowledge. Modern scientists might call it environmental attunement. The sailors just called it knowing the sea. Among maritime communities like the Samabajo, Tausug, and Yakan, navigation wasn't a matter of reading instruments but of interpreting signs. The way wind cut across the skin told a sailor whether they were headed off course. The angle at which seabirds wheeled overhead hinted at the proximity of land. The salty taste of the breeze, when mixed with a certain thickness in the air, signaled an approaching shoal or worse, a storm. These were the subtle cues used to make decisions that could mean the difference between landfall and vanishing beneath the waves. This was navigation, rooted in multi-sensory literacy. Sound played a role too. The pitch of wave slaps against the hull, the distant roar of surf on a hidden reef. Eyes scanned not just the horizon, but the surface shimmer of the water, alert for unusual turbulence or fish behavior. Even the smell of the air changed with depth and proximity to certain types of seaweed. For these sailors, travel was an all-body experience. It might sound like superstition to the uninitiated, but this was no guesswork. Historians have documented how these navigators could predict monsoon changes days before they hit just from the quality of the sunset or the resting positions of coastal birds. These observations, repeated across generations, became a kind of empirical science. Not written, not graphed, but remembered. Mainstream history often skips over this kind of knowledge, perhaps because it doesn't translate neatly into Western academic frameworks. But it's worth noting that during the age of exploration, European ships armed with maps, compasses, and astrologers often relied on local guides who navigated more effectively without any of those tools. In many instances, colonial explorers quite literally followed in the wake of indigenous knowledge. Filipino sailors, for their part, weren't just hugging the coast. They were capable of true open ocean voyaging. With a mix of ancestral memory, star navigation, and ocean reading, they could travel between islands hundreds of kilometers apart. In fact, archaeological evidence and oral history suggest regular maritime connections between the Philippines and distant regions like Taiwan, Indonesia, and Micronesia, long before Europeans set foot in Asia. Historians still argue whether these Filipino routes were documented systematically or passed along entirely through oral culture. The answer seems to be a mix of both. The shell maps discussed earlier may have served as mnemonic devices, but the real navigation occurred in the mind and body. In that sense, every sailor became a living map, holding a mental atlas that shifted with seasons, stories, and personal memory. Quirky practices developed to help maintain this skill. In some communities, apprentices were taught to sail blindfolded, not in open waters but in controlled conditions, to help them develop a feeling for current direction and wind behavior. The goal wasn't just to reach a destination, but to become so deeply synchronized with the sea that the sailor could feel when something was off. It was almost like becoming an extension of the vessel. This connection was sometimes described in spiritual terms. Many seafarers believed the ocean had moods: happy, angry, indifferent, and learning to read those moods was essential. A sailor who didn't respect the sea's temperament would eventually be punished, and that punishment was usually swift and fatal. Hence, a culture of humility prevailed among the best navigators. They knew that even a lifetime of skill could be undone by a moment of arrogance. It wasn't just people watching the sea was watching them back. Some rituals reinforced this relationship. Before embarking on long voyages, offerings were made: food, coins, or charms tossed into the water to appease unseen spirits. Some sailors wore talismans tied around the arm or neck, often crafted by a village healer or a respected elder. These weren't just superstition, they were emotional anchors, grounding the sailor in a network of trust and protection. Navigation wasn't separate from life, it was life. In places where land was limited and survival depended on successful fishing or trade, the ability to sail safely across open sea was as essential as breathing. Whole families depended on it. A missed reef, a misjudged tide, could erase generations in a single night. And yet this deeply embodied knowledge is rapidly vanishing. As motorized boats replace sail canoes and smartphones edge out inherited memory, younger generations often skip the old ways. But in some corners of the archipelago, traditions still cling on. A few elders teach the next wave of seafarers to listen, not to the engine, but to the wind, not to the compass app, but to the way the clouds stack up before sunrise. Some say this gut instinct will never return once lost. Others believe it's always there, dormant, waiting to be reawakened by necessity or curiosity. Either way, Filipino sailors remind the world that knowing a place, truly knowing it, requires more than maps. It requires presence, attention, repetition, and above all, a willingness to let the environment become your teacher. For much of maritime Filipino history, navigation didn't unfold over vast, uninterrupted blue. It was a constant game of leapfrog across hundreds of islands, shoals and reefs. What scholars sometimes refer to as island hopping, but the process was far more sophisticated than the name suggests. Each journey between islands was a carefully calculated segment, often based on seasonal changes, wave patterns, and long-established memory trails. The result was an interlinked network of sea routes, and guiding it all was the shell map. To outsiders, shell maps might appear too crude to serve as real guidance, but within the communities that used them, they operated like tactile memory networks. Their purpose wasn't to be consulted during the trip, like a modern GPS or even a sailor's chart. Instead, they were memorized ahead of time. A navigator might sit for hours before a voyage, studying the bend of each rod and the placement of every shell. Each element symbolized something lived: a cross-current at a specific point in the route, the location of a coral ridge just beneath the surface, or the approach to an island that could only be seen at low tide. These routes weren't arbitrary. The Philippines, with its 7,000 islands, offered natural waypoints every few dozen miles. But not all paths were equal. Some waters hid treacherous reefs, unpredictable currents, or shoals that shifted with storms. Certain lanes became preferred over time, favored for their relative safety, or because they followed specific currents. These were the arteries of the ancient maritime network, and shell maps encoded them in ways as poetic as they were precise. One striking feature of this kind of navigation is how it turned the ocean from a void into a landscape. In Western traditions, open sea was often feared, depicted as a vast, empty expanse between points of interest. But in the Filipino context, the sea was full. It was thick with meaning, history, and infrastructure. Every crossing was a thread in a larger web, and every sailor knew which threads connected where. And while not all Filipino communities used shell maps in the same form, the concept of encoding journeys into objects or gestures was widespread. In some places, the maps were made with cords or woven from reeds. In others, knowledge was sung, transformed into rhythmic patterns that could be remembered more easily while rowing. The knowledge was adaptable, shifting to fit the community and its geography. It's tempting to assume these systems were all passed down in a linear, structured way, like an ancient syllabus. But that wasn't the case. Much of this knowledge came from lived experience. Children accompanied elders on short trips from early ages. They learned through immersion, feeling the boat rock, observing how the horizon changed with movement, and listening as older sailors narrated each step of the way. Over time, they absorbed a map, not on paper, but in their bones. Some sailors described feeling when they were approaching land long before they could see it. They couldn't always explain it. Perhaps it was a change in the rhythm of waves, the smell of distant vegetation, or the behavior of birds overhead. But whatever the source, it was reliable. This sixth sense wasn't mystical. It was the product of layered experience, honed over years at sea. There were also practical cues embedded within each island hop. Certain rocks served as visual markers, with notches or discolorations used to align one's course. Vegetation could be read like a text. Palms that leaned inland hinted at prevailing winds, while isolated clusters of mangroves might indicate nearby freshwater sources. At night, the glow of phosphorescent plankton sometimes revealed tidal flows. Everything was part of the code. One lesser-known fact is that some navigators deliberately timed their travels with lunar phases. Full moons provided light, yes, but they also affected tides, which in turn altered the ease or danger of certain routes. A shallow channel passable during neap tide could become impassable under spring tide conditions. Sailors who misread these timings found themselves stuck, or worse, grounded on razor-sharp reefs. There's evidence to suggest that particular islands acted as junctions hubs, where different routes converged. These places often held spiritual or political significance. Some were meeting points for trade or storytelling. Others were avoided due to reputations of danger or sacredness. These meanings were often embedded into the shell map, perhaps in the placement of a rare shell or a double-twisted cord that told the user this stop matters. Scholars still debate whether Filipino shell maps were used more for open sea voyaging or for near-coastal navigation. Some argue that they served mostly as learning tools, while others maintain they were key instruments for planning extended travel between major island clusters. But what's not disputed is their cultural importance. These maps weren't just tools, they were touchstones of identity. They held memories, roots, and cautionary tales all in one. And crucially, they made the sea feel smaller, not in a limiting way, but in a connective one. Sailors knew where they could get food, where fresh water waited, where to wait out storms. The ocean was big, but it wasn't endless. It was home, once you knew how to read it. In that sense, every shell map represented more than geography. It was a symbol of trust in the sea, in one's community, and in the unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back through the generations. A chain that, even now, hasn't quite snapped. Among the many truths buried beneath the waves of pre-colonial Filipino life, one stands out: memory, not ink, held the map. While shell maps and other mnemonic devices certainly existed, the real navigation happened in the minds of the elders, those men and women who had crossed the same waters so many times that their understanding of the sea had become something close to instinct. In these communities, cartography was a human act, not a drawn or printed one. The elder navigators were living archives. These elders were revered not just for their age, but for their experience. A sailor who had safely made dozens of island crossings during storms, typhoons, and monsoons held more practical value than any religious leader or village head. He or she carried roots, rituals, weather patterns, and the oral tales tied to each location. These individuals didn't just remember facts, they remembered when a certain reef shifted, or when a migratory pattern of seabirds changed after a volcanic eruption. They were deeply attuned to patterns across years and decades. Teaching didn't happen in formal classes. Instead, it happened during daily life, quiet moments in canoes, during net repairs, or while eating freshly grilled fish on a beach. Instruction was subtle and layered. An elder might simply ask a younger sailor, "Where do the waves begin to flatten?" or "What color is the foam near the rocks today?" Over time, this constant questioning trained the student to observe, remember, and eventually predict. Knowledge passed down in this way became emotionally charged. It wasn't sterile data, it was inherited responsibility. A mistake on the water could cost lives, so learning from the elders wasn't just about competence, it was about honoring those who came before and ensuring the safety of those who'd come after. The shell map, in this setting functioned more as a mnemonic trigger than a primary source of direction. Before a voyage, the navigator might sit with an apprentice and run their fingers across the map, speaking aloud each segment of the journey. This curve is the current that pulls to the west after the second island. This shell is where the winds twist from the south and churn the tide. This knot is the safe anchorage, but only during low tide. The object sparked the story, and the story, once told enough times, embedded itself in memory. What's particularly fascinating is how much variation existed across communities. Some elders used entirely different mental maps for the same waters, depending on what season they were traveling or what their own lineage had emphasized. One might mark a reef as dangerous, while another saw it as a reliable landmark. There was no single, absolute truth about the sea, only a collection of remembered truths, contextual and flexible. Historians still argue whether this decentralized, oral system represented a form of resistance to colonial frameworks. With no centralized map, no universally agreed naming system, and no fixed records, the knowledge became difficult to steal or exploit. Spanish colonizers struggled to impose navigational order in the Philippines precisely because the locals didn't organize their world in a way that could be easily captured by ink and paper. And yet this approach had its challenges. When elders passed without apprentices, the knowledge risked dying with them. There were entire routes that vanished this way, sections of sea that had once been active with trade or migration, later forgotten because no one lived long enough to retell them. In this sense, each elder was a map, with an expiration date. Still, the tradition endured longer than many expected. Even into the early 20th century, Filipino navigators, especially among the Sama Bajau, continued using memory-based navigation, often outperforming modern sailors in familiar waters. Their methods, shaped by decades of learning and layers of cultural meaning, couldn't be replicated overnight by outsiders. It took more than tools. It required belonging. One of the quirkiest elements passed on by elders was the use of metaphor to describe routes. A narrow pass between rocks might be called the sea's eyelid. A swirling eddy could be the crocodile's breath. These descriptions weren't just poetic, they were mnemonic. A student was more likely to remember the danger of a tight current if it was described as the eye of a sea monster. In this way, navigation became a form of mythology. Over time, these metaphors layered into local folklore, stories of enchanted islands, whispering currents, or mermaid-guarded coves, often originated as ways to communicate environmental hazards. A beach where the spirits pull down swimmers might actually be a place with dangerous undertows. It was knowledge encoded in story, a clever, durable way to ensure survival. In today's digitized world, where mapping is outsourced to satellites and phones, it's easy to forget how extraordinary these human maps really were. They weren't infallible, sailors did get lost, ships did sink, but they represented an astonishing depth of cultural continuity, a knowledge base that was in many ways more resilient than any paper map left to rot in a humid archive. At its core, the Filipino elders' navigational role was about stewardship, not just of people and boats, but of the sea itself. They remembered where to fish, and when to leave the reef alone. They taught respect for the creatures and rhythms of the water, the shell map, the stories, the whispered advice. They were all expressions of a worldview, where the ocean wasn't an obstacle, but a living memory passed on, one generation at a time. At a quiet cove shaded by coconut trees, a group of seafarers gather under a thatched roof, weaving shells and sticks into something that seems more ritual than utilitarian. The structure resembles what Western eyes might call a stick chart or shell map, but for centuries the assumption was that such tools belonged exclusively to the seafarers of the Marshall Islands. And yet, across the broader Austronesian world, including the Philippines, similar traditions emerged. This overlap has led to a lively debate among historians and anthropologists. Did Filipino communities develop shell mapping independently, or were these techniques brought in through cultural diffusion? The Pacific Ocean, while vast, has long been a medium of exchange. From as early as 3000 BCE, Austronesian-speaking peoples set out from Taiwan and southern China, spreading south and east into the Philippine Islands, then onward to Indonesia, Micronesia, and as far as Polynesia and Madagascar. With them came shared technologies, outrigger canoes, fire-making techniques, rice and taro cultivation, and maritime knowledge that would evolve and diversify across islands and centuries. The Marshallese stick charts are the best documented examples of shell mapping, preserved in a few museums and studied in detail. These charts consist of curved and straight sticks representing wave patterns and currents, with shells or knots marking islands and key locations. Filipino examples, on the other hand, are more fragmented. Fewer specimens have survived, and ethnographic accounts tend to be localized and incomplete. But what's clear is that a parallel practice existed. Maps made of shells and sticks, often used as memory aids before setting out to sea, were documented in parts of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, regions historically connected to long-distance maritime trade. Some scholars argue that the similarities between Marshallese and Filipino navigational tools point to a shared origin, a sort of ancestral seed that branched off as communities dispersed across the Pacific. Others suggest independent invention, arguing that the environmental needs of seafaring peoples naturally led to similar solutions. After all, when one spends enough time watching wave patterns and memorizing island chains, organizing that knowledge physically becomes a logical next step. What adds a layer of complexity is the timing of European colonization. Spanish, Dutch, and later American forces disrupted local knowledge networks, often destroying indigenous cultural artifacts in the process. Records were lost, and oral traditions interrupted. While the Marshall Islands remained relatively untouched by Europeans until the 19th century, the Philippines endured centuries of colonization from the 1500s onward. As a result, fewer Filipino shell maps were preserved, and those that did survive were often misclassified or ignored by colonial ethnographers. In some cases, shell maps may have been mistaken for decorative items or children's toys. Others were likely destroyed in the name of civilizing local customs. What remained was memory, recollections by elders, folk stories, and odd artifacts, sitting unlabeled in museum backrooms. This has made it difficult to establish the exact origins and uses of these maps in the Filipino context. Despite this, echoes of the practice persist in unexpected places. Among the Samabajol, for instance, one of the most sea-oriented communities in the Philippines, navigational knowledge has long been expressed through tactile memory. These boat-dwelling people rarely use written tools, but rely on embodied experience passed down through generations. While formal shell maps may not be common among them today, the logic of spatial storytelling through physical representation still underpins how voyages are taught. Interestingly, some of the debate has shifted from the tools themselves to the broader concept of indigenous epistemology. Rather than asking whether Filipinos copied Marshallese charts, scholars now explore how different communities develop knowledge systems tailored to their specific geographies. In this view, both groups could have arrived at similar navigational frameworks independently, not through borrowing, but through parallel innovation. There's also the matter of trade routes. The Philippines sat at a major crossroad of maritime commerce, connecting China, the Malay world, and the wider Pacific. Sailors, from across the region, would have exchanged stories, tools, and perhaps even maps. In such a setting, it's plausible that ideas moved fluidly between communities. A shell map might have been brought from Palau, adapted in Mindanao, and then passed on in modified form to the Sulu Islands. Cultural exchange rather than strict inheritance or invention may be the real story. What makes this debate fascinating is how it challenges Western models of historical progression. Rather than tracing innovation through linear nationalistic lines, it reveals a messier, more organic story, one shaped by ocean currents, seasonal winds, and generations of trial and error. And then there's the fringe theory, one that suggests a deep, ancient seafaring culture connected the Pacific in ways modern scholarship has only begun to grasp. This theory, sometimes met with skepticism, proposes that prehistoric voyagers traveled farther and more often than previously believed, sharing linguistic and navigational routes across thousands of kilometers. It's not mainstream, but it has gained traction as evidence of prehistoric cross-oceanic links accumulates. Historians still argue whether Filipino shell maps are proof of a lost shared maritime knowledge system or simply an echo of multiple overlapping traditions. But either way, they challenge the dominant narratives. They prove that the sea was not a barrier, it was a bridge, not an empty space, but a dynamic arena of innovation. In the end, What matters most may not be whether these maps were invented here or borrowed. What matters is that they worked. They guided people across storm-tossed waters, around deadly reefs, and toward distant islands, long before any European knew such places existed. They connected communities that colonial borders would later try to separate, and they carried stories, quietly, persistently, across the sea. The sea, vast and seemingly chaotic, speaks in patterns. For Filipino navigators, one of the most critical skills was learning how to listen to those patterns, especially the language of the currents. These weren't passive forces, they shaped routes, influenced speed, and determined safety. Understanding currents meant surviving them, and in the age of shell maps and memory-based navigation, reading the sea's movements was both an art and a science. A shell map might feature a curve of stick that mimicked the arc of a persistent current between two islands. The angle mattered. A straight rod might indicate calm passage. A sharply bowed one warned of strong pull or turbulence. These weren't random constructions. They were visual metaphors that communicated motion, a current pushing northward here, a countercurrent beneath a reef there. Each detail mattered. Currents in the Philippine archipelago are notoriously complex. The region sits in a confluence of oceanic and atmospheric forces. Warm waters from the Pacific push through the eastern islands, while monsoon winds shift seasonally, tugging at the sea like an invisible hand. Add to this the narrow straits, submerged ridges, and ever-changing seabeds, and you get a maritime labyrinth where sailing blind could mean disaster. Filipino navigators didn't have modern oceanography, but they had observation and generations of it. They knew that certain channels pulled harder at dusk, or that a particular inlet reversed its current with the full moon. They charted, in memory or through physical markers like shell maps, the talking currents, those that changed their behavior abruptly or resisted typical patterns. These were the ones that could turn a routine crossing into a deadly one. One of the more curious aspects of current navigation was the use of temperature and salinity as cues. Sailors would trail their fingers in the water, noting subtle shifts in warmth or density. A colder touch might suggest deeper, faster-moving waters, while a warmer layer could indicate proximity to shore or a slowing eddy. This tactile skill was often taught from childhood, refined until it became instinct. And then there was the role of sound. In narrow channels or reef-flanked passages, the noise of water told stories. A higher-pitched bubbling might signal turbulence, while a low, steady hum could mean steady flow. In many communities, elders trained younger sailors to pause at certain points and simply listen, to close their eyes, tune out the creak of the boat, and focus on the soundscape beneath them. The sea, after all, had mood. Some navigators even claimed to feel current direction through their knees or elbows, points of contact with the canoe's frame. Whether this was genuine sensory perception or the result of countless repetitions blending into muscle memory is hard to say. What's clear is that such claims were common enough to be taken seriously within these communities. One fringe theory, occasionally dismissed, occasionally defended, suggests that certain currents were even named and categorized, much like roads. Oral traditions in the Visayas refer to the Snake Road, a winding current path, known to test even the best navigators. Others mention the Split Water, a location where two tidal flows meet and swirl unpredictably. These terms aren't found in Western hydrography, but persist in local storytelling, hinting at an indigenous science of current classification. Historians still argue whether such embodied navigation was more reliable than early European techniques using rudimentary compasses and dead reckoning. In confined archipelagic environments like the Philippines, many believe local methods were not only more accurate, but also more adaptive to real-world conditions. A compass might point north, but it couldn't tell you how a seasonal swell was going to shift your boat at the next turn. The shell map and the body could. And it wasn't just humans who provided guidance. The behavior of fish and birds often clued sailors into underwater movements. Schools of flying fish leaping in a specific direction might suggest a current line or underwater ridge. Seabirds that lingered in odd formations near the surface often signaled nutrient-rich upwelling currents, useful not just for fishing but for navigation. What made current knowledge so vital was its mutability. Unlike islands or stars, currents change. They respond to wind, tide, weather, and sometimes seemingly nothing at all. This made adaptability essential. Filipino sailors weren't memorizing static facts. They were learning dynamic relationships. They needed to know not just what the current did, but when and why it changed. Shell maps, again, functioned as tools for embedding and communicating this complexity. They didn't just list destinations. They modeled the sea's personality. A network of bent rods crossing at multiple angles might replicate the convergent zone of multiple flows. To outsiders it looked chaotic. To the trained eye, it was a behavioral map of the ocean. Interestingly, some communities used floating debris or driftwood as indicators. A specific type of palm husk, spotted bobbing repeatedly in a certain direction, was a cue to a subtle but consistent current. This kind of improvisational signage was hyperlocal, something only residents of that particular waterway might understand. It's worth noting that colonial powers rarely understood the sophistication of this current literacy. They might see locals hug a coastline or delay a journey and dismiss it as superstition or laziness. What they failed to grasp was the precision involved, calculations based on observation, experience, and an unbroken relationship with the sea. And this knowledge had real consequences. A mistake in timing, departing too early or too late, could mean paddling against a force stronger than any muscle. Some routes had windows of just a few hours when the current allowed passage. Miss that, and the journey might double in length, or become impossible altogether. Even today, in some fishing villages, traces of this wisdom remain. Elder fishers speak of listening to the water or waiting for the sea to breathe right. The language may sound poetic, but behind it lies a deep, intuitive grasp of hydrodynamics, a body of knowledge that was once as essential as knowing how to walk. Star-based navigation, often associated with Polynesian voyaging, was equally significant in parts of the Philippines. While not as extensively documented, oral traditions and ethnographic records reveal a vibrant celestial tradition among maritime peoples like the Sama Bajau, Tausug, and Yukon. In their world, certain stars weren't just pinpoints of light, they were markers of routes, memory anchors, and seasonal indicators. As the sky deepens into a navy hue, flecked with the early emergence of stars, the ocean begins to reflect a second world, a mirrored sky, rippling gently. For generations, Filipino navigators have looked upward to find their way forward. The stars, like the sea, were teachers. They held direction, time, season, and story, all strung across the heavens in constellations that weren't just decorative, but instrumental. In the grand story of Filipino navigation, the currents weren't obstacles, they were collaborators. Unruly, unpredictable, but ultimately knowable. All it took was the patience to listen. Young navigators often learned the stars by sleeping outside on the beach, watching how they shifted hour by hour, night after night. Elders pointed them out like parents naming distant relatives. That one rises with the easterlies, or you'll see that one just before the rains come. The sky became a community of elders itself, predictable, revered, and above all, reliable. One essential concept in this tradition was the idea of star paths. These were invisible routes traced across the sky by rising constellations. A navigator at sea would steer toward or away from a particular star, adjusting course as it rose higher or sank. In many cases, stars acted like celestial signposts. Follow this one to reach the nearest atoll. When it passes overhead, adjust to the one behind it. The journey was not just directional, but rhythmic. The night sky acted as a map laid flat above. The Southern Cross, a key navigational tool across the Pacific, was used to find true south, while constellations like Orion's belt helped align eastward travel. Sailors memorized not just the stars' locations, but their rising and setting points across seasons. These observations created an internal calendar and compass, woven together. Historians still argue whether Filipino star navigation operated on the same level of complexity as in Polynesia, where double-hulled canoes sailed thousands of miles using star lines and sidereal compasses. There's little doubt that the broader Austronesian migration shared a foundational understanding of the sky, but due to colonial disruptions and sparse documentation, the Philippine version remains less detailed in modern records. Nonetheless, The fragments that survive suggest a deeply intuitive and locally adapted system. Interestingly, different stars were associated with different types of weather. A certain star's appearance might herald the onset of Habagat, the southwest monsoon, known for its wet turbulence. Others announced calmer sailing windows, dry seasons, or favorable tides. This integration of astronomy and meteorology was not taught in formal schools. It was embedded in songs, stories, and routines. Some Filipino communities even named constellations differently than Western astronomy. For instance, the Pleiades cluster, often called the Seven Sisters in Greek mythology, held different meanings locally. In parts of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, its visibility marked the time to plant, fish, or prepare for storms. These cultural interpretations were woven into everyday decisions. One particularly fascinating practice involved pairing stars with landmarks. For example, a navigator might sail toward a star until it aligned with a known mountaintop or island silhouette. This combination of celestial and terrestrial alignment created a more precise method of orientation, especially during open sea segments between larger islands. When clouds blocked the stars, sailors relied on memory, recalling where stars should be, even if they couldn't be seen. The poetic nature of this method is hard to miss. Traveling by starlight evokes a sense of reverence, of moving within a cosmos that's not just above, but intertwined with daily life. This intimacy with the night sky is rare in today's world of city lights and digital maps, but for these sailors, it was second nature. It wasn't always perfect, of course. Mistakes happened. Stars can deceive if the sky is hazy, or one's internal timing is off. But experienced navigators knew how to cross-check with other signs, wave patterns, bird behavior, or the distinctive scent of land. In this way, the stars formed just one part of a multi-layered navigational system. There are accounts of older navigators humming low melodies while watching the stars, part ritual, part mnemonic device. The rhythm of the song mirrored the rhythm of the paddle or sail, creating a trance-like concentration. This musical connection to navigation hints at an even deeper, close bond. For these sailors, direction wasn't just about sight, it was a full-body awareness. Even today, in remote coastal areas, a few elders still look up at the sky and recall those ancient paths. They no longer rely on them to sail, perhaps, but the knowledge lingers. It survives in stories told to grandchildren, or in gestures made toward the horizon during evening walks along the shore. In the modern age, there are movements to revive this knowledge. Community-led heritage programs have begun documenting these oral traditions, sometimes pairing them with astronomical software to track the same stars their ancestors once followed. And in this small act of convergence, digital and ancestral, there's a quiet return to something nearly lost. To truly understand how Filipino navigators mastered the sea, one must look beyond the tools and stars and into the very heart of their learning spaces. These weren't schools in any conventional sense. There were no chalkboards, desks, or written syllabi. Instead, learning took place on driftwood canoes, within the crashing arcs of monsoon waves, and around firelit gatherings, where lessons were folded into stories. The ocean itself was both classroom and curriculum, and every voyage was a test. This system of maritime education has been called many things: experiential, oral, indigenous. But to the people living it, it was simply life. Young boys and girls from coastal or seafaring families learned by doing. Their first textbooks were the patterns of foam left behind by a retreating wave. Their first teachers were parents, uncles, or seasoned fishers, who taught not through lectures but through rhythm and repetition. Ultimately, the stars above the Philippines still shine the same way they did centuries ago, and if one listens carefully, they still tell stories. Not just of myth and legend, but of navigation, survival, and belonging. For those early Filipino sailors, the sky wasn't just a map, it was a promise that even in darkness, direction is always possible. Unlike modern education, failure wasn't something to avoid, it was essential. Taking the wrong route and returning late was a lesson. Misjudging the tide and having to wait it out on a sandbar overnight was part of the training. The ocean offered immediate feedback, it punished arrogance and rewarded patience. In this way, Filipino maritime learning was brutally honest, but profoundly effective. Children often began by observing. They watched how the elder paddled, not just the motion but the timing of the strokes relative to wind direction or wave chop. They listened to how decisions were made aloud. We'll cut across now, the tide's shifted, or that cloud means we turn back before noon. Over time, these moments stitched together into a fabric of intuitive knowledge. Many began by helping with small tasks, bailing out water, holding nets, or assisting in repairing sails. As they grew more comfortable, they graduated to short voyages along familiar coasts, where mistakes were forgiven by calm waters. Eventually, they moved to riskier, open sea segments. There was no graduation ceremony, no certificate. The only indicator of mastery was being trusted to sail alone. Some communities went even further, initiating elaborate tests for would-be navigators. One lesser-known but fascinating practice involved blindfold training. A young apprentice might be placed in a canoe, spun around, and set adrift in calm water. Their task, to identify direction using only their other senses, listening to waves, feeling current pressure, tasting the salt in the air. It may sound extreme, but this method honed their situational awareness in ways that formal tools never could. A key element of this education was ritual. Before major journeys, communities often performed ceremonies, some religious, others purely cultural. These rituals weren't just symbolic, they were ways to prime the mind, focus attention, and ensure that the lessons of past generations were respected. Some involved chanting old phrases believed to awaken the spirits of the sea. Others were simpler, like rubbing a charm or reciting the names of islands in sequence before departure. These practices weren't just about tradition, they served as mnemonic devices. For example, the sequence of island names in a chant might mirror the order of a well-traveled route, or a song about sea spirits could contain embedded advice on how to read weather signs. The line between superstition and science in this world was intentionally blurred. Historians still debate how widespread these narrative-based methods were. Some accounts come from the Visayas, others from Mindanao or the Sulu archipelago. What's clear, however, is that education in these communities wasn't linear. It was cyclical, immersive, and constantly reinforced by lived experience. This hands-on education also relied heavily on storytelling. Elders would tell tales not just to entertain, but to encode knowledge. One such story might go, "There's an island where the birds fly backward before the storm." In truth, the tale was a coded way of saying, "Watch for seabirds changing their usual flight patterns," a warning of shifting wind. Another story might say, "The water sings when it's hiding rocks," a poetic reminder that certain sounds in shallow areas meant submerged danger. This educational system also produced more than just navigators. It shaped a worldview. Learners came to see the ocean not as a void to be crossed, but as a layered environment, full of personality. Every wave, every breeze, every ripple was interpreted. The ocean was alive, with moods, voices, and preferences. One didn't simply learn the sea, one entered into a relationship with it. And the sea, of course, wasn't always forgiving. Typhoons, shipwrecks, and loss were all part of the education. These moments became cautionary tales. A reef that claimed a cousin's boat would be named and remembered. A sandbank that shifted unexpectedly might become a metaphor in a local song. Tragedy was folded into the curriculum, not to terrify, but to preserve the memory and ensure it didn't repeat. Today, many of these practices are fading. Outboard motors have replaced sails, mobile apps have replaced instincts. But in certain pockets among older Samabaje mariners or in fishing villages along Palawan, traces of this educational model still flicker. A child mimics the way her grandfather taps the boat rail. A teenager times his cast net by the shadows of clouds. Learning continues, quietly. One fringe account, often dismissed, occasionally reconsidered, tells of a wandering navigator who failed his final test and chose to live alone on a mangrove island, teaching only those he deemed worthy. While probably apocryphal, the story captures the respect accorded to master navigators. They were not just seafarers, they were knowledge keepers, myth bearers, and community guides. And as the tide pulls in, it's clear that these driftwood schools didn't vanish, they just changed form. The ocean still teaches, and some are still listening. In a world where maps fade and records are scarce, the ocean serves as a vast, living archive, and within it, shells tell stories. For Filipino navigators, the sea was not just a highway, but a library. Each route, each bend in the current, each island pass held a narrative. And within the logic of shell maps, these stories were frozen, not in ink or stone, but in delicate arrangements of coral, twine, and bone. To run one's fingers across a shell map was to read a chapter of collective memory. Shell maps in the Filipino context operated as more than navigational devices. They were repositories of oral history. Each shell placement could symbolize an island, yes, but also the event that made that island significant. A reef marked with a rare shell might be remembered not for its geography, but because it was the site of a tragedy or a moment of triumph, or a spiritual encounter. The physical layout was only half the meaning. The rest lived in the story that accompanied it. What made this even more powerful was the role of performance. Shell maps were rarely static displays. They were often read aloud, with a master navigator guiding a younger sailor's hand across the framework, narrating the journey it represented. Here is where the water splits, where the sea becomes confused. This shell, see it? That's the reef where your uncle's boat was overturned. This knot, it's the place we camped during the northern storm, where the moon rose red. Each gesture carried layers of knowledge, emotion, and memory. Because of this, a shell map was often inseparable from its navigator. Without the accompanying knowledge, the object was inert, just sticks and shells on string. But in the right hands, it came alive. It could recall storm routes, ancestral fishing grounds, or the burial site of a revered sailor lost at sea. The map was not merely geographic, it was narrative. It's this dual nature, both functional and mnemonic, that made shell maps so resilient, even as the materials themselves were fragile. These were not items to be mass-produced or universally standardized. Each one was unique to its maker and their community. One elder's map might emphasize safe harbors, while another might highlight seasonal currents. Still another might encode stories of origin or migration. No two maps told exactly the same tale. This performance turned the map into a living document, one that grew richer with each retelling, and it allowed for fluidity. Over time, details could shift slightly, allowing the story to adapt to new experiences or observations. In this way, shell maps resembled oral epics, flexible, evolving, but deeply rooted in tradition. Interestingly, this narrative richness also functioned as a system of cultural memory, events that weren't recorded in writing. Famines, storms, migrations could be embedded in the maps and preserved through repetition. A shell might represent the site of a miracle, or a curse, passed down through generations as both lore and caution. In this sense, the sea became a canvas, and the shell map a kind of illustrated manuscript, shaped by salt, time, and need. Historians still argue how deliberate this mnemonic system was. Some believe shell maps were explicitly designed to encode stories, while others suggest that the storytelling emerged later as a way to reinforce navigational information. But whatever their origin, the outcome is clear. These maps were more than tools, they were cultural artifacts, steeped in meaning. In certain cases, shell maps were only shared within bloodlines. A father might pass it down to his child, but only after certain rites were completed. These acts weren't just ceremonies, they were tests. One had to prove themselves worthy of holding the memory. The map wasn't just a family artifact, it was a key to inherited knowledge. Losing it, or mishandling it, was considered a grave failure. A quirky detail, often found in preserved maps, is the use of unusual materials. While most used shell and wood, some featured human hair, teeth, or animal bones. These elements were symbolic, tied to personal lineage or sacred significance. A map built with a deceased navigator's bone, for instance, was believed to hold his memory. It became a kind of relic, consulted with reverence and sometimes guarded with secrecy. This system of knowledge preservation becomes even more poignant when viewed against the backdrop of colonization. As written records in the West came to dominate the concept of history, Oral traditions like those embedded in shell maps were dismissed as folklore or myth. Many were lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed. The ocean, once a library of indigenous knowledge, became a frontier to be conquered and renamed. And yet, some maps endured, hidden in homes, buried with elders, or reimagined in local rituals. They continued to function quietly. Even when their original meanings faded, their presence hinted at a deep, unbroken lineage. A map once used to mark a sacred shoal might now hang on a wall as decoration, but for those who know, it's a sign of survival. In recent years, researchers have begun revisiting these artifacts with renewed curiosity. Anthropologists interview elders who still remember the old roots. Artists collaborate with communities to reconstruct lost maps. And in schools, young Filipinos learn about these traditions, not as quaint relics, but as sophisticated systems of knowledge. This resurgence is more than academic. It reflects a broader shift toward valuing indigenous epistemologies, ways of knowing that don't fit neatly into Western frameworks, but are no less valid. The shell map, once overlooked, is reclaiming its place as a vessel of both science and story. Because when all the paper maps have faded and the batteries in our GPS units have died, what remains is memory. The kind carried in shells, the kind passed down by hand, the kind that rides the waves and refuses to be forgotten. Among the Sama Bajau, Tausug, and other coastal peoples, the ocean was not simply a body of water, it was alive, moody, and deserving of respect. The idea that one could tame or dominate the sea was not only arrogant, it was dangerous. Instead, sailors approached the ocean as a living force, complete with spirits, tempers, and desires. Navigating it successfully meant forming a relationship, and that relationship was built on rituals, taboos, and charms. In the moonlit silence before departure, the navigator stands beside his canoe, murmuring something under his breath. It isn't a prayer in the Western sense. It's older, softer, closer to a conversation, with the sea, with the wind, with the ancestors. This is not just a sailor, but something more, a shaman sailor, one who moves between the physical and spiritual worlds with each stroke of the paddle. In traditional Filipino seafaring communities, navigation wasn't purely mechanical, it was mystical, and in many cases it was inseparable from belief. Many navigators wore amulets, small pouches sewn into clothing, or charms tied around the neck, wrist, or ankle. These might contain bones, teeth, bits of coral, or inscribed metal believed to ward off evil currents. Some were inherited, others made specifically for a single journey. The belief was not that these objects provided absolute protection, but that they could influence the sea's temperament, soften its edges, pacify its anger. One of the most common practices before a voyage involved offerings. A pinch of rice thrown into the surf, a few drops of blood from a sacrificed chicken, or a whispered recitation of ancestral names. These acts weren't superstition for the sake of it. They were expressions of humility, of seeking permission. No one owned the sea. You had to ask to cross it. This spiritual framing extended to the vessels themselves. Canoes and boats were often treated as animate beings. They were named, spoken to, and in some cases married to the sea through ceremonial rites. Boat building was accompanied by blessings. Before the first voyage, elders might anoint the hull with herbs or oils believed to protect against misfortune. If a boat was damaged or lost, it wasn't just property, it was a death in the family. Perhaps one of the most curious taboos concerned bananas. In some regions, bringing bananas aboard a vessel was considered extremely unlucky. The reasons vary. Some say it has to do with their slippery nature. Others believe it stems from a myth in which a banana tree led a sailor to his doom. Whatever the case, even today, older mariners might eye a bunch of bananas with suspicion before boarding a boat. These beliefs weren't just cultural decoration, they were embedded in decision-making. A navigator might delay a trip because the wind feels wrong, or cancel a departure after a bad dream. Outsiders often dismissed such choices as irrational, but seasoned sailors knew better. Intuition, shaped by years of subtle observation and emotional attunement, was a tool as critical as any shell map. Historians still argue whether this blending of spiritualism and seamanship weakened or strengthened traditional navigation. Some claim it led to overly cautious behavior, limiting exploration. Others argue the opposite, that it encouraged respect, caution, and sustainability in maritime life. What's undeniable is that the shaman-sailor model produced individuals who were as psychologically prepared for the journey as they were physically. In some communities, especially those with animist traditions, the navigator also acted as a kind of medium. He would enter trance states before or during voyages, believed to communicate with sea spirits or gain guidance from ancestors. In extreme cases, whole villages would fast or pray during a particularly dangerous journey. The voyage wasn't just personal, it was collective. The sailor carried not just cargo, but the community's hopes and fears. Rituals could be elaborate. A well-documented practice among some groups involved painting sigils on the boat, using a mixture of soot, ash, and fish oil. These marks weren't decorative, they were protective symbols, passed down through generations. Others involved spoken charms, chants that mirrored the rhythm of paddling, designed to talk to the water. One chant might ask the sea to be gentle. Another might request that the wind carry the boat swiftly, but not recklessly. Interestingly, these rituals weren't static, they evolved with need. If a certain chant stopped working, if a journey ended poorly, it might be revised or abandoned altogether. This adaptability made the system remarkably responsive to lived experience, while still grounded in tradition. One fringe belief, seldom spoken aloud, but whispered in coastal villages, was that the ocean could hear lies. That is, if a sailor spoke with arrogance, denied his fears, or disrespected the memory of a lost elder, the sea would respond harshly. Whether metaphor or warning, the belief served a practical purpose, to encourage honesty and humility in the face of forces no one fully controlled. Even the structure of travel reflected this blend of belief and observation. Voyages often began at certain times of day, depending not just on tidal charts, but on omens, bird calls, cloud shapes, or how the waves slapped against the hull during launch. This process wasn't arbitrary, it was patterned, refined, and quietly profound. Today, many of these practices have faded or become symbolic. Few modern sailors chant to the sea before launching their motorboats, but the underlying respect remains, especially among elders. They still offer food to the water during feast days. They still nod toward the horizon when speaking of loved ones lost at sea. And some, when launching a new canoe, still whisper its name so the sea knows who has come. In this worldview, navigation is never just about reaching a place. It's about traveling well, with care, intention, and awareness. The shaman sailor doesn't just move through space, he moves through meaning. And in doing so, he reminds us that the journey is never truly separate from the spirit. There is a moment in every sailor's life when the map disappears, not physically, but metaphorically. In the world of traditional Filipino navigation, this was a rite of passage. After years of observing shell maps, studying the stars, and memorizing currents, the true test was not how well one could read the map, but how fully the map had become internalized. The navigator no longer needed to look at it. They had become the map. This transition from external tool to internal compass is central to how navigation was taught and practiced. The shell map, in all its intricate simplicity, was never meant to be carried aboard. It was reviewed, traced, discussed, and memorized on land. By the time the boat pushed off from shore, the navigator carried only what was in their head, and perhaps more profoundly, in their body. This embodied knowledge is a hallmark of many indigenous navigational systems. In the Philippines, it manifested in subtle ways. A navigator might adjust course not by checking instruments, but by noticing how the wind shifted through the rigging, or how the sun warmed the back of their neck. Muscle memory, visual memory, and instinct blended into a seamless awareness that allowed the sailor to make real-time decisions with astonishing accuracy. Observers often marveled at this ability. How could someone cross open water with no visible land in sight and still arrive at a tiny, barely there island hours later? The answer lies in years, sometimes decades of sensory training. By the time a sailor was ready to voyage solo, they had already made the trip mentally dozens of times. Every reef, wave change, and shoreline curve was already mapped out in their mind. This phenomenon is not unique to the Philippines, but the Filipino expression of it is deeply connected to local values, community, humility, and resilience. Learning to navigate without the physical map wasn't just a test of skill, it was a sign that the navigator had matured. They were now trusted with not just routes, but stories, ones that could be carried forward even when the original shell map had worn away. There are accounts of navigators who in their later years could sit and close their eyes, then sail a full route in their mind. They would hum softly, mimicking the waves, and shift their body as though leaning into a real current. To watch this was to witness a kind of living simulation, an early form of virtual reality, powered not by code, but by memory and imagination. This internal mapping was reinforced through repetition. Routes were taken over and over again, each time embedding more information into the navigator's psyche. Even variations were remembered, how the sea behaved during the wet season versus the dry, or how the scent of distant mangroves might change depending on wind direction. Over time, these layered experiences created an intuitive logic. A navigator could feel when something was off. The angle of sunlight didn't match the expected shadow, the waves slapped at an unfamiliar rhythm, or the usual bird calls were absent. These subtle cues alerted the sailor that they drifted from the ideal path, even if only by a kilometer or two. Adjustments were made not with panic, but with calm, practiced confidence. Historians still discuss how these navigators process spatial information. Did they visualize a bird's-eye map, like a Western sailor might imagine, or was their internal sense more narrative, experienced moment to moment like a song or unfolding memory? Many suggest the latter. Navigation for these sailors was a temporal experience. It had rhythm, flow, and structure, like a well-told story. The journey unfolded in time as much as in space. One of the more curious outcomes of this internalization was that maps could differ slightly between individuals. Two sailors might describe the same route with different emphasis, one recalling a tricky cross-current, another focusing on the timing of star alignments. This variability wasn't seen as error, but as personal style, much like how two musicians might interpret the same song differently. Each navigator brought their own feel to the sea. In this way, the shell map became something more than a tool. It was a teacher, one that, if studied long enough, dissolved into the mind. The navigator didn't just carry information, they became the knowledge, and in doing so, they contributed to the tradition. Every voyage added new layers, new stories, sometimes even corrections to old assumptions. The map, while invisible, kept evolving. This process was especially important in a world without written records. With colonial disruption and environmental change, physical maps could be lost. But if a navigator had memorized a route, it could be passed on, spoken aloud, performed, or reenacted on the beach. It survived. The internal map was more durable than palm wood or twine. One fringe belief, rarely acknowledged in formal histories, is that some master navigators could sense routes even on land. They would walk a shoreline and feel how it curved, as if the wind and water had left traces in the air. Whether or not this is true, it speaks to the deep integration between person and place in this tradition. The land, the sea, and the body were not separate. They were expressions of the same story. Today, in scattered coastal villages, you can still find elders who navigate this way. They don't pull out charts or check the weather app. They sniff the wind, glance at the sky, and launch. Their students, if they have any, don't watch screens. They watch the world. Slowly, they build their own internal maps, layer by layer, wave by wave. And if you ask them where they learnt to sail, they'll smile, point to their chest, and say something like, "It's all in here now." In the training of a Filipino navigator, there comes a point when confidence must meet chaos. To prepare for that, some communities developed one of the most disorienting rituals in traditional seafaring, the act of getting lost on purpose. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal exercise, an intentional plunge into disorientation meant to sharpen intuition and cement internal navigation. It was equal parts test, tradition, and transformation. Among the more remote maritime groups, there are documented stories of young apprentices being blindfolded, spun in circles on a canoe, and set adrift into calm or semi-calm waters. Sometimes they were accompanied by an elder in a separate vessel. Other times, they were watched from the shore, trusted to manage on their own. The goal, to force the body to navigate without reliance on sight or fixed points. It was a training in feeling. For a modern audience, the idea might sound reckless, even cruel. But within its cultural context, it was viewed as essential. A navigator needed to develop more than memory. They needed to internalize rhythm, pressure, sound, and temperature. The ocean was a living terrain, and these tests helped sailors build a relationship with it, beyond the visual. In disorientation, they learned trust. The ritual served other purposes too. It tested emotional control. Panic could doom a sailor more quickly than a storm. Being blindfolded at sea induced fear, yes, but also required stillness. Only in stillness could the signs return. The slap of waves against the hull, the pattern of breeze across the cheek, the direction of bird calls, or the way the swell moved beneath the boat. Some elders claimed they could locate themselves within a few meters, just by noting how the boat bobbed. A gentle rocking to the left, then a sharp pitch meant they were near a shoal. A smoother, deeper roll indicated open water. These sensations became as reliable as any compass, perhaps even more so, since they couldn't be dropped, lost, or broken. Such sensory training wasn't limited to blindfold rituals. Other exercises involved paddling in silence through unfamiliar waters at night, or deliberately taking wrong routes and correcting without instruction. Every mistake became a lesson. Navigation wasn't about perfection, it was about recovery. Knowing how to adapt when the map failed or when memory blurred was the mark of a true navigator. Historians still argue how widespread such practices were. Documentation is sparse, mostly passed down through oral accounts and fragmentary interviews. Some believe these rituals were localized to more isolated communities, where apprenticeship took on deeper symbolic meaning. Others argue that variations of intentional disorientation existed throughout the archipelago, each shaped by local belief and geography. One unusual version of this practice involved navigating backwards, rowing or sailing in reverse. Without turning the head, the exercise forced the sailor to rely entirely on peripheral cues, sound reflections, and water tension. Another fringe tradition described in the oral histories of Mindanao tells of dreamwalking, where young navigators were encouraged to visualize the entire journey during sleep, then compare their recollection to the actual trip the next day. Whether literal or metaphorical, these stories reflect the deep psychological engagement sailors had with their craft. Perhaps the most fascinating element is how these disorientation rituals echo modern training in other high-stakes disciplines. Pilots and astronauts undergo simulations that replicate loss of control. Military survival schools practice sensory deprivation. The aim in every case is to teach calm, adaptation, and self-trust. Filipino navigators were centuries ahead of that curve, doing it with nothing but waves, wind, and a canoe. Cultural interpretations of this training were rich with metaphor. Some described the ocean as a teacher that only reveals truth when you stop trying to control it. Others said the sea had eyes, and that being blindfolded was an act of trust. If you respected her, she would guide you home. And there were darker stories too, where those who failed the test never returned and became part of the ocean's memory. But most viewed the ritual not as punishment, but as an initiation. Once completed, the apprentice was seen differently. They were no longer just a passenger or learner. They were someone the sea had accepted. Someone who had listened in the dark and come back wiser. In a broader sense, this rite also served as a metaphor for life at sea. Disorientation happens, even to the best. Winds shift, storms arrive unannounced, stars vanish behind clouds. The navigator's task isn't to prevent chaos, but to move through it without losing their center. To let the body remember what the eyes can't see. This philosophy has profound implications beyond navigation. Teaches that stability isn't external, it comes from within. When the world tilts, when the way is unclear, the experienced sailor does not freeze or flail. They breathe, they listen, and they adjust. Today, very few communities still practice blindfold training. The dangers are higher, the cultural context diminished, but the idea survives in other forms, in how elders train younger sailors to sail by feel, or how children are taught to recognize coastline, sounds before they learn the names of islands. Some fishing families even turn off engines and drift for hours, challenging one another to guess their location using only sensory cues. And perhaps that's the enduring lesson. Maps may vanish, memories may fade, but the sea is always speaking. To those willing to lose themselves for a moment, it just might show the way. The sky darkens quickly in the tropics. And when it does, the sea becomes a place of uncertainty. Storms, especially typhoons, have long haunted the lives of Filipino sailors. These were not minor squalls or passing rains, but cataclysmic events capable of wiping out entire fleets and altering coastlines. And yet within this threat emerged another layer of navigational brilliance: the art of hiding from chaos. Filipino navigators didn't just learn how to avoid storms, they learned how to survive them. Typhoons, known locally as bagyo, are born in the warm Pacific and drift westward with terrifying force. For sailors relying on outriggers, sails, and wind-rid intuition, facing one unprepared was unthinkable. Shell maps, oral traditions, and community memory all played roles in storm preparedness. Long before satellite weather data existed, navigators recognized subtle signs of a coming typhoon. A sudden drop in temperature, eerie stillness in the air, unusually low tides, or even silence from seabirds that normally filled the sky. Over generations, these warning signs were committed to collective memory. Families had specific words or chants that described the look of storm horizon clouds: layered, bruised, and fast-moving. A particular kind of humidity, sometimes described as sticky like raw rice, was another omen. These weren't folk tales, they were meteorology wrapped in metaphor, passed down because they worked. When storms became unavoidable, Filipino navigators didn't head out, they headed into safety, into hiding. The archipelago's geography, with its countless bays, estuaries, and coves, offered secret sanctuaries known only to locals. These places were part of every skilled navigator's mental map. A shell map might even include them: a curve indicating a sheltered lagoon, a knot marking a natural windbreak behind a limestone cliff. One such place, according to oral tradition in the Visayas, was called the Mother's Lap, a cove shaped like a cradle, invisible until you were almost upon it. Navigators knew it could safely harbor a small fleet through even the fiercest storms. Another location in Palawan was known as the place the wind forgets. The story went that during a powerful storm, boats that reached this spot found only light drizzle and silence. Whether myth or memory, the locations were real, and often used. There's also a tactical element to these hideouts. Sailors understood that certain types of shorelines were more dangerous during specific storms. A sandy beach might be fine during regular weather, but deadly during a bagyo due to its exposure to storm surge. Instead, rocky enclaves, with high natural walls, dense mangroves, or surrounding reef barriers, were favored. These environments dampened wave impact and blocked direct wind, creating relative calm. And there was etiquette, too. If a sailor found someone already sheltering in a cove, there were unspoken rules about space and support. Provisions might be shared, damaged boats were helped to shore. In these moments, rivalry gave way to solidarity. The storm, after all, didn't care who fished where last season. Everyone was equally at its mercy. Historians still debate whether this network of storm shelters was formalized. Some believe there were communal agreements or coded ways of marking them, perhaps through carvings on rocks or symbolic arrangements of driftwood. Others argue it was strictly oral, passed only to those who needed to know. Either way, the knowledge endured and saved lives. One of the more surprising features of this practice was its temporal rhythm. Navigators tracked not just where to hide, but when to emerge. They knew that a typhoon's calm eye could be a deadly illusion. Stories tell of impatient sailors who left shelter during the eye, believing the storm had passed, only to be caught and overturned by the second, more violent half. The lesson: the storm isn't over when the wind stops. It's over when the ocean says so. There's also a cultural layer to storm response. In some communities, typhoons were seen as cleansing forces, punishing arrogance and testing humility. A sailor who ignored the signs and lost his boat wasn't pitied, he was chastened. Survivors often credited their safety, not just to good decisions, but to proper conduct. Did they make the right offerings? Did they heed the warnings? Did they respect the stories? Even the shell maps reflected this reverence. Some maps included symbols not only for geography, but for memory. A broken shell might mark the site of a previous shipwreck. A burned piece of wood, woven in with the rest, could represent a route that was no longer safe after a deadly storm changed the seabed. These quiet additions served as warnings, updates passed down through materials as much as words. A few shell maps even took on the form of storm-only guides, objects brought out only during Baguio season. These were often built differently, tighter construction, smaller in size, made for quick memorization. One elder described such a map as a whisper in your hand, something you didn't show off, but kept close, a secret between you and the sea. There's a strange beauty in this way of navigating disaster, not by trying to overpower it, but by folding into it, finding stillness within violence. The ocean could rage all it wanted, but a skilled navigator knew how to vanish into its folds. Today, many of these storm shelters are mapped and named in modern charts. GPS systems mark them, and coast guards monitor them. But the old names, the Mother's Lap, the Windless Place, still linger in the stories of elders. And when a storm rolls in, you can still find small boats tucked into the same coves, their owners watching the sky with practiced eyes. Because while tools have changed, the sea has not. It still speaks in warning signs. It still tests. And those who remember how to listen, how to hide, how to wait, how to survive, still pass the test. The 16th century brought sweeping changes to the Philippine archipelago. The arrival of Spanish galleons, missionaries, and colonial administrators introduced new systems of governance, religion, language, and maps. For the Filipino navigators, who had, for generations, used shell maps and embodied knowledge to traverse their world. This period marked the beginning of a difficult transformation. In the wake of empire, many of their charts, stories, and methods were overwritten or simply ignored, but not all was lost. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, their priority was domination through cartography. Mapping the islands, labeling ports, and measuring distances became acts of control. These new maps were drawn from the ship's deck, from a distance with the authority of the compass and quadrant. They reduced the complex maritime environment into fixed lines and Latinized place names. And in the process they dismissed indigenous mapping systems, if they noticed them at all. Traditional Filipino shell maps and oral navigation had no place in the colonial vision. Spanish records mention native pilots, or indios, who guide ships, but they rarely describe how these pilots learn their routes. The implication was clear. The value of indigenous navigators was practical, not intellectual. Their knowledge was used when needed, then discarded when compasses and European-trained crews became available. This erasure extended to cultural artifacts. Shell maps were often seen as curiosities or decorative items. Some may have been taken as souvenirs by friars or officers, only to be lost in European collections or mislabeled in archives. Others were destroyed outright, swept away in efforts to replace pagan knowledge with Christian doctrine. Entire vocabularies related to the sea, rituals, chants, and weather omens were banned or forgotten under pressure to convert and assimilate. Yet, despite this onslaught, traditional navigation didn't disappear. It adapted. In coastal communities far from colonial centers, navigators continued to use the old ways, quietly, discreetly, and often in parallel with new tools. Some learned how to use Western compasses, only to return home and teach their children using wave patterns and stars. Others incorporated borrowed terms into their own seafaring lexicon, blending Spanish words with local logic. There's a striking example of this hybridization in the Sulu archipelago. Here, boat builders began carving decorative elements onto the hulls of their vessels. Spirals, animal motifs, abstract waves that also served mnemonic functions. They weren't just for show. Some patterns echoed the shape of wave flows or referred to specific shoals. The colonial authorities may have vained them as art, but sailors knew better. These carvings were memory aids, maps in disguise. Stories too adapted. Legends of sea spirits and ancestral guidance began to include new elements. In some regions, the Virgin Mary took on attributes of a sea goddess. Fishermen prayed to her not just for blessings, but for calm waters and safe passage. Catholicism, in this sense, didn't erase the old beliefs. It gave them a new costume. This blending allowed maritime knowledge to survive within an acceptable framework. Still, The shift in educational structures had a cost. As formal schools grew and literacy became tied to success, the old apprenticeship model weakened. Shell maps, which had once been passed from hand to hand, were now viewed as relics of a less advanced time. Younger generations, encouraged to seek work on larger commercial vessels or in cities, often abandoned traditional navigation altogether. Historians still argue whether this loss was inevitable or imposed. Some believe that indigenous mapping systems would have faded naturally as trade routes expanded and technology improved. Others contend that the colonial suppression of oral knowledge, combined with church-led destruction of pagan practices, amounted to cultural sabotage. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. A particularly painful chapter in this transition occurred during the American colonial period in the early 20th century. U.S. authorities implemented new education systems that emphasized English, Western science, and geography. Indigenous knowledge was categorized as folklore, placed in anthropology textbooks rather than seamanship manuals. Filipino students were taught the names of European explorers, but not the names of the stars their ancestors followed. And yet, fragments of the old ways continued to flicker. A handful of shell maps survived in private homes. A few elders still remembered the chants. A carved symbol on an old canoe carried meanings no outsider could decode. In this way, Filipino navigation became like a tide pool, small, self-contained and easy to overlook, but still vibrant with life. One fringe belief, passed down quietly in parts of Mindoro and Bohol, claimed that some maps were intentionally hidden during the Spanish era, buried near beaches or sealed in clay pots. These secret archives, if they ever existed, have never been found. But their legend speaks to a deeper truth, that people knew their knowledge was under threat, and they fought to preserve it, however they could. In some communities, this resistance took the form of silence. Elders refused to share the full extent of their knowledge with colonial officials or missionaries. They taught only within families, or passed information through metaphor. This secrecy, while effective for survival, also meant that much was lost. The chain of memory weakened, but it never fully broke. Today, the colonial wake is still felt in how maritime history is taught. Western maps dominate textbooks. European routes are highlighted, but in the quiet margins of the Philippines' coastal communities, a different history whispers. A history of shell maps, of unseen routes, of knowledge that refused to drown. Because even when the waves of empire crashed hard, some memories held their breath and waited for calmer seas. With colonial pressures mounting and the outward signs of traditional navigation suppressed or forgotten, the knowledge didn't vanish, it evolved. In coastal communities, fragments of ancient seafaring wisdom began to hide in plain sight. Songs, dances, seasonal festivals, even rice harvest rituals became unlikely vessels for nautical code. Where once there had been shell maps and spoken instructions, now there were hymns that told you which wind was rising, or dances that hinted at when not to sail. This subtle preservation strategy wasn't accidental. As religious conversions spread and colonial scrutiny intensified, indigenous knowledge systems had to adapt or risk extinction. So, navigational cues, like the direction of currents or the timing of tides, were cloaked in cultural practices deemed acceptable by colonial and church authorities. In essence, Filipino communities wove their wisdom into performances, layering meaning beneath metaphor. Take, for instance, the coastal harvest dances in the Visayas. On the surface, they celebrated the rice season, complete with costumes, drums, and synchronized movements. But beneath the choreography was a set of encoded messages. Certain steps imitated wave rhythms, others mimicked the paddling motions needed to ride a seasonal swell. One dance sequence, always performed just before the planting season, mirrored the timing of the northeast monsoon, an important sailing window for longer maritime journeys. Similarly, hymns sung in church services occasionally contained coded weather knowledge. A line that spoke of winds that kneel before the morning sun was more than poetic. It referred to a calm patch sailors could expect just after dawn during the Amihan season. Another verse might describe a sea of scattered light, alluding to the look of the water just before a typhoon's edge arrives. These interpretations weren't taught openly, but they were passed through families, sometimes as riddles, sometimes as casual observations during festivals. Historians still debate the intentionality of this hidden code. Was it a conscious act of resistance, or an unconscious blending of knowledge systems under pressure? The answer likely varies by region. In some places, especially those closer to mission centers, blending may have been strategic, a way to protect maritime knowledge from religious purging. In more remote areas, it may have been instinctive, part of an unspoken cultural reflex to preserve what matters most. Interestingly, certain musical instruments were also tied to this coded preservation. The kudiapi, a type of boat lute, was sometimes used to play rhythms that mimicked paddling strokes. In some communities, the tempo of a song suggested not just mood, but actual wave conditions. A slow, heavy beat meant rough seas. A light, syncopated rhythm pointed to favorable conditions. The musician wasn't just performing, they were forecasting. Some rituals tied to fishing or boat launching also carried embedded knowledge. In one practice found in parts of Mindanao, families would pour a libation of rice wine in 4 directions before casting off. The direction in which the liquid first disappeared, absorbed by the sand or soil, was read as a sign of wind behavior that day. Though explained as a spiritual act, it also served a practical purpose, gauging wind direction through surface pressure. These acts of encoded survival weren't always subtle. In some harvest festivals, floats shaped like boats were paraded through town, ostensibly to honor local saints or deities. But older participants might include subtle design elements, a shell in a certain spot, a rope tied in a specific knot, the angle of a paddle pointing northward. These cues communicated weather expectations or sea conditions for the upcoming season. Observers who didn't know the signs would miss them entirely. In the same way, children's games sometimes reinforced old maritime teachings. A circle game that mimicked sailing around obstacles taught children to recognize the logic of island-hopping routes. A jump rope song might casually reference a reef or shoal by name, likely a warning passed down with cheerful disguise. One of the more fringe theories in this field suggests that even textile patterns encoded navigational hints. Certain weaves found in coastal communities contained repeating motifs of spirals and diagonal lines. To the outsider, these were decorative, but some researchers have argued that the motifs mirrored current flows, wave directions, or island groupings. While this theory is debated, it opens up intriguing possibilities about how layered the cultural preservation may have been. The resilience shown by these communities underscores a central truth about indigenous knowledge. It is adaptive. When one path is blocked, another is forged. Filipino navigators and their descendants didn't give up their understanding of the sea. They simply hid it, not out of shame, but out of wisdom. They recognized that some knowledge survives best when it isn't too visible. Even today, some of these encoded traditions remain. A grandmother sings a lullaby that references stars she doesn't name directly. A fisherman performs a yearly ritual just to be safe, though he might not remember exactly why. In many cases, the knowledge persists even as its context fades, but it's there just beneath the surface, like a reef hidden under clear water. And as scholars, artists, and community leaders return to these traditions, they're finding more than nostalgia. They're finding maps, not just of routes or currents, but of memory, adaptation, and resistance. Shell maps may have vanished from hands, but they never left the culture. They just changed form into dance, into drumbeats, into whispered stories told over rice and fish. In that sense, the legacy of Filipino maritime navigation isn't confined to boats or seashells. It pulses in every coastal ritual, in every song that lingers too long on a particular note, in every gesture that seems too precise to be accidental. The ocean's knowledge found new homes, and it's still speaking, softly to those who know how to listen. In recent years, the tide has begun to turn. Across the Philippines, from the bustling piers of Cebu to the quieter islands of Tawi-Tawi, communities, scholars, and artists have started to rediscover what colonial history nearly drowned: the ancient art of Filipino navigation. This is not a revival led by textbooks or institutions alone. It is a return carried out by the descendants of the original shell map users, the seafarers, whose ancestors read the water by wave and starlight. The shell whisperers are coming back. The movement didn't begin with grand announcements. It started quietly, with elders remembering. In interviews with researchers, old fishermen began to speak of routes their fathers used, stories once told on moonless nights, or chants sung before launching boats. These recollections, once dismissed as folklore, began to reveal detailed systems of navigation hiding beneath their poetic surface. Slowly, the narrative changed, from superstition to science, from forgotten to foundational. One key force behind this resurgence has been community-driven ethnography. Instead of relying solely on academic frameworks, researchers have partnered with local navigators to document knowledge in ways that feel authentic. That means recording chants, mapping remembered sea routes by hand, and gathering stories from the few remaining elders who still remember how to feel their way across the ocean. Some of the most exciting work is happening in collaboration with maritime schools and local NGOs. Young people from coastal villages are being invited to learn both the old and the new. One week might involve learning GPS. The next, sitting with a shell map replica and tracing currents with their fingertips. The point isn't to replace modern tools, but to reconnect with knowledge that was never truly lost, just waiting for the right conditions to resurface. In Tawi Tawi, programs led by cultural advocates have helped revive interest in the Sama Bajo's traditional methods. Students interview their own grandparents, build miniature boats based on pre-colonial designs, and recreate shell maps using found materials. Some even participate in memory sails, where they attempt short journeys without instruments, relying on oral directions and environmental cues. This blending of generations is at the heart of the revival. Many young Filipinos raised in urban centers or educated in Western systems never learn the sea beyond family beach trips or school geography. But through these programs, they're discovering that the history of their people doesn't begin with colonization or end with modernity. It stretches across the waves, carried on the memory of tides and the shimmer of distant islands. One particularly poignant project involved reconstructing lost routes between islands, based on surviving oral accounts. Elders described the time it took to reach a destination, the feel of the current under different monsoon winds, and what birds to expect overhead. When these descriptions were mapped using modern satellite tools, the paths aligned almost perfectly with known oceanographic patterns, proving, once again, the precision of indigenous knowledge. Historians still argue over how best to classify this revival. Is it anthropology, cultural restoration, resistance? In truth, it's all of these, and something more. It's a reclamation of identity through memory, a declaration that Filipino seafaring didn't end with colonization. It simply went quiet for a while. Art has played a powerful role too. Installations featuring shell maps made from driftwood, coral, and wire have appeared in museums and galleries. Poetry inspired by navigational chants has been performed at cultural festivals. Filmmakers and writers are crafting stories that center around pre-colonial navigators, casting them not as side characters but as heroes. These acts of creative reimagining give emotional shape to the revival, turning data into story and story into pride. One fringe development, gaining quiet traction, involves digital reconstructions of shell maps, using 3D modeling and augmented reality. Some artists and technologists are creating immersive educational experiences where users can hold a shell map, rotate it, and explore the routes encoded within it. In one pilot project, students learned how a specific shell's placement indicated not just location, but wave behavior during certain tides, a tactile lesson made digital. This return has not been without its tensions. Some worry that in reviving these traditions there is a risk of simplifying or romanticizing them, reducing centuries of complex knowledge into museum pieces or tourist attractions. Others push back against the idea of preservation entirely, arguing that knowledge should evolve, not be frozen in time. These debates are healthy. They reflect a community that cares deeply about how its story is told. Still, the overall momentum is hopeful. What was once shame associated with poverty, backwardness, or superstition is now being reclaimed as genius. To navigate open ocean with nothing but stars and memory is no small feat, and young Filipinos are starting to see their ancestors not as the colonized, but as explorers in their own right. There's a quiet dignity in this return. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't shout, it moves like the tide, slow, persistent. impossible to stop. And with every new shell map reconstructed, every chant remembered, every route sailed by intuition, the sea gives back a little more of what it once held. Because the ocean, like memory, never forgets. It only waits. In a small fishing village where the wind whistles through nipper palm leaves and children run barefoot across sun-warmed sand, a boy crouches beside his grandfather, tracing lines in the dirt. He's not just doodling, he's drawing a map, a route to an island he's never visited, guided only by the old man's quiet instructions. The boy knows nothing of Google Earth or maritime charts, but he understands rhythm. He listens, and in that moment, tradition is not only remembered, it is reborn. This is how ancient knowledge often survives, not through formal teaching, but through conversation, imitation, and curiosity. And nowhere is that more evident than in the growing movement to pass navigational wisdom to the next generation. The children remember differently, not through repetition of rote methods, but through a hybrid of digital tools, family stories, and new experiences that blend the old with the new. Today's young learners don't grow up in the same world their ancestors did. Most have access to mobile phones, weather apps, and satellite positioning. But that doesn't mean they're disconnected. In fact, many are becoming bridges between worlds, balancing modern convenience with a hunger for ancestral roots. They're learning to code and to paddle, to trace shell maps in the morning, then study marine biology in the afternoon. And this synthesis might just be what ensures the survival of ancient Filipino navigation. In schools and coastal outreach programs, students are increasingly being exposed to cultural heritage initiatives focused on maritime traditions. This includes storytelling sessions with elders, field trips to rebuild traditional boats, and even augmented reality experiences where shell maps are visualized in interactive space. These are not just novelties, they are pedagogical innovations. By integrating ancestral knowledge with contemporary learning styles, the past becomes present again. One powerful example took place in Palawan, where a youth group partnered with older fishermen to chart old routes between small islands. Using both oral accounts and GPS data, they overlaid traditional paths onto digital maps. The results surprised even seasoned cartographers. The routes closely mirrored known current flows and safe passages. What the young people saw wasn't just evidence of navigational brilliance. It was a reconnection to identity. This identity building is key. Many young Filipinos have grown up without a strong connection to indigenous knowledge systems, particularly in urbanized or Western-influenced environments. By reintroducing shell mapping, celestial navigation, and current reading into youth education, communities are offering more than history lessons. They are giving young people a way to see themselves not as remnants of colonization, but as inheritors of innovation. The youth are also helping push boundaries. In Mindanao, a student-led project is experimenting with biomapping, using traditional shell map concepts to create ecological maps of reef health and fish migration. While the shell map was never meant to track biodiversity, the underlying principles, observation, pattern recognition, and memory, translate beautifully into environmental science. In this way, young navigators are taking the past forward, adapting it to modern concerns. There's also creativity at play. Students in some coastal schools have begun crafting new shell maps, not replicas, but reinterpretations. They use beads and wires, driftwood and plastic debris to create art that functions both as homage and exploration. Some of these pieces are exhibited in local cultural centers, while others stay in classrooms where children explain to visitors how this knot means a strong tide, or this shell is where my grandfather fished. This innovation doesn't always sit easily with traditionalists. Some elders worry that the true essence of the old ways may be diluted by modern reinterpretations. Others, however, see promise. They recognize that survival has always required change, and they trust the next generation to listen with respect, even if they remix the format. Historians still argue whether today's revivalists are recovering something lost or reinventing something new. The line is blurry. What is clear is that the knowledge is not static, it never was. The seas change, the winds shift. So must the ways they are understood and taught. One fringe idea being explored by youth-led marine groups is the concept of digital shell maps, apps or web-based tools that allow users to input traditional knowledge alongside real-time environmental data. These platforms don't aim to replace oral teaching, but to support it, preserving stories while adapting them for wider audiences. In a way, it's the natural evolution of the shell map, still a guide, still shaped by hands, but now expanded by screens and code. In this environment of revival and reimagination, something remarkable is happening. The children aren't just passive recipients of tradition, they're active agents in its renewal. They ask questions, they test boundaries, they seek meaning, and in doing so, they become shell whisperers in their own right. New voices in an ancient conversation. Even in places far from the sea, cities like Manila or Davao, there are signs of reconnection. College students create podcasts about indigenous maritime law. Art students animate shell maps for social media awareness. Some even plan to travel to ancestral provinces to meet the last remaining elders who remember the sea as it was, before engines and GPS. And so, across archipelago and algorithm, a generational thread is being rewoven. It's not always neat, it's not always perfect, but it is alive, because the ocean still has stories to tell. And the children, these digital sailors with one hand on the past and one on the future, are listening. The ocean has always been more than a body of water to those who depend on it. For traditional Filipino navigators, it was a living entity, one that responded, resisted, remembered, and while modern maps and technology might reduce it to surface and depth measurements, the sea, as understood by indigenous communities, was far more interactive. It was a voice, a breath, a pulse, and in quiet moments, between paddles, beneath stars, or beside sleeping islands, it could whisper back. Among many coastal cultures in the Philippines, this sense of a sentient sea persists. Stories abound of sailors who claim to hear the ocean speak, not in words, but in sensations. Sudden shifts in water tension, changes in wind direction, or even dreams that arrived the night before a voyage. These aren't just poetic flourishes, they are part of a worldview where the environment is not a backdrop, but an active participant. Navigators spoke of the ocean as an elder, sometimes stern, sometimes forgiving. Before departing, they'd often sit by the shoreline in silence, observing wave patterns or the call of seabirds. It was less about superstition and more about tuning in. The idea wasn't to control the sea, but to enter into dialogue with it. This kind of listening went beyond the physical. Many believed the sea remembered things. A shipwreck left emotional residue. A place where a sailor died might feel heavy for generations. Even successful journeys were said to leave a kind of imprint, something that changed the rhythm of the water or the pattern of fish migration nearby. Whether these claims were spiritual, psychological, or ecological is beside the point. For the navigator, they were real. One of the more curious traditions involved speaking to the water directly. Before pushing off, a sailor might whisper a phrase, a promise, or a plea. "Don't fight me today," one might say, or "let me pass in peace." These words weren't performative, they were relational. They reflected an understanding that the sea was listening, and that it remembered how you treated it last time. In some communities, there was a strong belief that arrogance could provoke the sea's wrath. A sailor who boasted too loudly, who mocked the wind, or ignored the birds, was said to be inviting trouble. The remedy was humility, silence, a bowed head as you set your course, and if you forgot, the ocean was happy to remind you, with a wrong current, a broken outrigger, or a sudden squall. Historians still debate whether these practices were religious, animist, or simply cultural expressions of caution. Some suggest they stem from pre-Islamic or pre-Christian belief systems. Others argue they reflect early forms of environmental ethics. Whatever their origin, the effect was clear. Sailors who treated the sea with respect tended to survive it longer. Even today, some of these traditions endure. In fishing villages along the Bicol coast, older fishers still murmur to the sea before casting nets. In the islands of the Visayas, boatmen glance to the horizon and pause, as if asking permission before departing. These rituals are small, often unnoticed, but they reveal a continuing belief in reciprocity, a contract of sorts between human and water. This relational approach to the ocean finds echoes in science too. Marine biologists now recognize how noise, vibration, and human presence alter marine ecosystems in subtle ways. The fish do respond, the currents are influenced, What indigenous communities understood intuitively, through stories and sensations, is increasingly validated by empirical research. The sea listens, it changes in response to a. One fringe account, shared by a coastal elder in northern Mindanao, tells of a navigator who would dip his ear into the water before each journey. He claimed he could hear the sea's mood. Calm waters, he said, sounded like slow breathing, angry waters growled. While modern ears might smile at such descriptions, those who knew him said he never sailed in bad conditions. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps it was listening. There's also the practice of sailing in silence. Some crews observed strict quiet for the first few hours of a voyage. No chatter, no singing, just the sound of paddles and water. The silence wasn't just ceremonial. It allowed them to hear the slap of a rogue wave, the distant thundercloud, the breath of the wind shifting. In the quiet, the ocean spoke louder. Modern technology often interrupts this dialogue. Engines drown out the subtle sounds. GPS creates a layer of abstraction. The sailor no longer needs to ask the sea. They ask a screen. And yet, even with all this convenience, mistakes happen. Boats capsize. Routes go wrong because while tools are helpful, they are not replacements for relationship. The revival of traditional navigation among younger Filipinos often includes a return to this listening practice. Elders teaching youth don't just share routes, they emphasize stillness. Sit by the sea, they say. Wait until it speaks. For many students, this is the hardest lesson. It requires patience, presence, and humility, traits not always rewarded in fast-moving modern life. And yet, those who learn it report something extraordinary. They begin to feel the sea differently, not just as terrain, but as character, not just as obstacle, but as partner. This shift, subtle though it is, may be the most important outcome of the navigational revival. It's not about turning back the clock, it's about returning to relationship. Because the ocean, like an old friend, remembers how you treat it. And if you listen, truly listen, it will guide you, maybe not with precision, maybe not with speed, but always with presence. And that, in the end, might be the most important direction of all. No maps, no elders, no stars, just sea in every direction. For centuries, this was the ultimate test for a Filipino navigator. To be dropped in unfamiliar waters with nothing but their training, their instincts, and the stories etched into memory. It wasn't just a rite of passage, it was a crucible that turned learned knowledge into lived truth. The question wasn't if the sailor would reach land, it was how they would find it, and what they would learn along the way. Such tests were rare, often reserved for the most promising apprentices. The setting wasn't completely reckless. Usually, the journey began within reach of known landmarks or safe currents. But the navigator was expected to proceed alone or with minimal support. No compass, no verbal help, no visual reminders, only the ocean and everything it had ever taught them. The process usually began with mental preparation. A sailor might sit for hours, replaying the route in their mind. They'd recall the feel of specific swells, the sound of birds heard near a certain sandbar, the way sunlight reflects off different water depths. It was a form of meditation, an immersion in the imagined journey before the real one began. Then came the departure. There was no ceremony, no crowd. Sometimes just an elder watching from the shore. As the canoe slipped away, the sailor entered the exam room. The sea itself. The first few minutes were critical. Could they detect the dominant current? Could they orient themselves without visible islands? Would the sky give them a star, a sunbeam, a cloud to guide by? Or would they have to rely solely on rhythm, the rocking of the boat, the breath of the wind, the scent of the salt? Historians still debate the full nature of these solo trials. Some accounts describe journeys of just a few kilometers, designed as confidence builders. Others speak of multi-day voyages, where the navigator had to land on a specific island, guided only by remembered cues. In these stories, success was not measured solely by arrival, but by composure, how well the sailor listened, adapted, and responded to the unpredictable. One of the more curious tactics used in these trials involved mimicry. Navigators would imitate natural rhythms to stay on course. They'd paddle to the beat of a remembered chant, matching their strokes to the imagined tempo of the sea they hoped to find. Others used chants not as music, but as timers, songs with precise lengths, that marked the time to the next directional check. It was like building a clock from memory and melody. There are accounts, too, of navigators using floating debris or animal behavior to make course corrections. A cluster of seaweed might indicate a nearby reef. The movement of jellyfish could suggest a shift in current. Even the sound of distant surf, barely audible, became a North Star. These cues weren't secondary, they were essential. A misread could lead a sailor hours, even days off course. And yet, even failure was instructive. Some sailors deliberately made wrong turns to see how the sea would respond. They would drift and recalibrate, watching how their body reacted to the change. A headwind might trigger a memory. A new current might pull them into an unexpected alignment. The sea, in this context, wasn't static. It was a teacher, correcting posture, attitude, and awareness with every wave. One fringe story, passed down in a small island near Panay, tells of a navigator who failed his solo test, landed far off course, but returned with a new route no one had known before. Rather than shame, he was celebrated. He had extended the map, not with rope and shell, but with courage and observation. This mindset of discovery through error was vital to Filipino navigation. Maps weren't fixed. They were updated constantly, with each sailor adding their own thread to the woven net of knowledge. A failed journey could become a future shortcut. A storm detour might reveal a new safe harbor. Nothing was wasted. Every experience was a map. This approach also shaped community identity. When a sailor completed a solo voyage, they weren't just seen as skilled, they were considered trustworthy. Someone who could guide others. Someone who had stared down the ocean's silence and listened long enough to find the answer. Their name carried weight. Not fame, necessarily, but respect. The kind of respect that meant others would follow when they said, "We go this way." Today, few sailors face such tests. GPS and engines have made solo sea travel safer, but also less meaningful in this traditional sense. But some families still practice simplified versions. A young sailor might be asked to lead a route without instructions, or to predict a landfall time based on weather signs. And in rare cases, full memory voyages are attempted, part tradition, part tribute. These moments serve as reminders that behind every screen, every modern chart, there was once a person in a wooden boat, trusting only what they knew and what the sea would reveal. And perhaps that's the core truth that Filipino navigation teaches, that knowledge is not static. It is earned, tested, corrected, and lived. And sometimes, the only way to find the path is to let go of the map entirely. In the dusty margins of 16th century Spanish logs, there are passing references to natives who guided ships through narrow straits, around reefs invisible to the European eye, or toward islands that weren't yet inked on any Western chart. These pilots, Filipino navigators armed with nothing but memory and instinct, were not named. Their tools were not described. Their knowledge was acknowledged but not respected, and yet they were there, quietly rewriting the narrative of exploration from below deck. For years, colonial historians painted a picture of discovery led by European courage and Christian conviction. But the reality, increasingly clear to scholars today, is that many of those so-called discoveries were guided, sometimes entirely, by indigenous expertise. Filipino sailors helped the Spanish navigate the archipelago. They warned of hidden shoals, timed crossings to monsoons, and advised on safe landing points. Without them, the Spanish conquest of the islands would likely have been slower, deadlier, or altogether impossible. This contribution was rarely recorded with any detail. Indigenous pilots were often listed generically as indios, or guides, with no attention paid to their navigational methods. Their knowledge, being oral, did not fit the colonial mold. What couldn't be mapped, written, or quantified was dismissed as anecdotal, useful in the moment, but irrelevant in the grand scheme of maritime history. But now, historians are beginning to re-examine these silences. The logs of early Spanish explorers, including those of Legazpi and Urdaneta, mention mysterious instances of unexpectedly successful navigation, often through treacherous regions like the San Bernardino Strait or the Sulu Sea. In some cases, Europeans remarked with surprise at how their local guides predicted tides or landfall with uncanny precision. One Jesuit priest noted, that a native steersman brought us to the correct anchorage in blackest night, without stars or torch. The question historians now ask is how. Shell maps may never have reached European hands, but the systems they reflected, wave reading, cloud behavior, star orientation, clearly persisted in these encounters. The navigators didn't need compasses, because they used the wind's shape and the water's voice. The Spaniards didn't understand it, but they relied on it nonetheless. In some cases, there's evidence that Filipinos reached new territories long before colonial arrival. There are oral histories among indigenous Taomes and Palawan peoples that describe visits from seafarers whose descriptions and dialects bear striking resemblance to early Visayan or Sama Bajau. These interactions, difficult to prove conclusively, suggest that Filipino navigators may have extended their reach beyond the archipelago in pre-Hispanic times. Historians still argue whether these voyages were organized exploration or opportunistic drift. Some lean on archaeological finds like pottery styles or tool similarities to suggest maritime contact. Others point to the linguistic links between Austronesian languages stretching from the Philippines to Madagascar and Polynesia. What is becoming increasingly difficult to deny is that long before Magellan, Filipino sailors were already moving through this vast maritime network. A fringe, but fascinating theory posits that certain pre-colonial routes between Mindanao and Sulawesi, or even as far as Papua, were regularly traversed for trade in birds of paradise feathers, pearls, and rare shells. The navigators who made these trips did not leave written records, but the trade goods they moved did. Some of these items ended up in burial sites far from their point of origin, carried across seas by hands no Western historian thought to credit. The absence of names in colonial logs is telling. To record a name is to acknowledge humanity and authorship. But by leaving these indigenous pilots nameless, the colonial narrative preserved the illusion of European supremacy. It also ensured that generations would overlook the true brilliance of these navigators, individuals who could guide wooden vessels by feel, by scent, by sound, and yet their legacy endures in quiet ways. In some coastal regions, place names still echo old navigational roles. Terms like punta, point, dalampasigan, shore, or bantay dagat, sea watcher. These weren't just geographic markers, they were job descriptions, responsibilities in a complex system of maritime stewardship. Today, scholars, divers, and indigenous researchers are reclaiming this history. New academic projects focus not on what Europeans wrote, but on what Filipino communities remember. Through oral accounts, material culture, and cross-cultural analysis, they are rebuilding the picture of a navigational tradition that never needed colonial validation to be real. In one community, in the southern Visayas, elders still recount a story about a man who guided 3 foreign ships to safety, only to be dismissed when the voyage ended. They took his knowledge, they say, but not his name. The tale is told not with bitterness, but with pride, because while the name was forgotten in the logs, it lives on in the currents, the reefs, the remembered paths, passed down through generations. Ultimately, the story of Filipino navigation is not just one of survival or skill, it is one of erasure and recovery. For centuries, these navigators stood behind the wheel without ever being seen. Now their presence is being acknowledged, and in that recognition, a deeper truth emerges, that the ocean was never empty before the colonizers arrived. It was already mapped, just not in ink. When Filipino navigators looked up at the night sky, they didn't just see stars, they saw pathways, calendars, and at times warnings. But these celestial guides were never neutral. While the stars might have been eternal, the way they were interpreted, taught, and used shifted under colonial influence. Over time, constellations that once marked seasons or sacred journeys were renamed, reframed, or erased. Even the sky, vast and seemingly beyond human control, was reshaped by empire. In the pre-colonial Philippines, star knowledge varied by region. Different groups had different names, stories, and practical uses for the same clusters of stars. A grouping known to one community as a fishing guide might be a timekeeper in another. These constellations were more than navigational aids. They were cultural anchors, tied to rituals, oral history, and seasonal cycles. One of the most commonly used stars for navigation was Orion's belt, often interpreted as three brothers, a string of fish, or a hunter depending on the locale. The Southern Cross helped mark direction during long-distance voyages, while the Pleiades, or Seven Sisters, served as an agricultural and fishing calendar. When they rose just before dawn, it was time to plant. When they disappeared at dusk, it was time to harvest or sail. This practical astronomy, sometimes called ethnoastronomy by modern scholars, was woven into chants, stories, and dances. A lullaby might include a reference to the eye of the sky opening or closing, signaling a shift in wind patterns. A coastal celebration might honor the star that guards the west, a cue to fish only in certain areas during certain months. The sky was full of such codes, if one knew how to read them, but with colonization came new systems of naming and interpretation. Spanish missionaries, eager to replace indigenous beliefs with Christian doctrine, began renaming the stars with saints and biblical figures. Where once there was a celestial canoe or a god's spear, there was now St. James's blade or Mary's veil. The stories that had guided sailors for generations were replaced with imported myths that held little connection to the sea. This wasn't just a symbolic shift, it had real effects. As star names changed, so did their meanings. Their functions in the cultural calendar were downplayed or dismissed, and their ties to place were severed. Over time, younger generations were taught to see the sky through a European lens. Western astronomy books, imported into mission schools, listed constellations with Latin names and Greek lore. The night sky became a textbook, no longer a tapestry of homegrown guidance. Historians still argue how deep this colonial erasure went. Some believe indigenous star knowledge remained strong in remote or resistant areas, surviving in oral form even as formal records were destroyed. Others contend that much was lost, especially where schools and churches dominated community life. What's certain is that many traditional celestial names have vanished from everyday use, preserved only in fragments or in the memories of elders. One poignant example comes from the islands of Mindoro, where the Mangyan people once used a star they called Binugsukan, literally the breaker. It was said to signal the return of certain fish along the coast. The name and function were passed down in song, not written anywhere. Today few remember what the star looks like, and its role has been largely forgotten. But the song hummed softly by an elder during a recent field study still survives. This change in celestial understanding reflects a larger theme in colonized regions, that even the most intangible elements of culture, like the sky, can be altered by power. The night sky, once a shared archive of meaning, was repurposed. It became a platform for empire, reinforcing Western systems of time, direction, and authority. And yet, the old knowledge was not completely erased. In quiet corners of the archipelago, families still reference the stars in local terms. A grandmother in Bohol might still say, "The fisherman's eye is watching," when Orion appears at dusk. A boatman in Sulu might adjust his course, not with a compass, but by checking the angle of the bird's claw, a star group invisible to most outsiders. There are efforts today to reclaim this lost sky. Ethnoastronomers, both Filipino and international, are working with communities to document surviving star knowledge. Fieldwork often involves listening to songs, collecting folk tales, and drawing celestial maps based on oral recollections. It's slow work, but meaningful. Each recovered name is a piece of a worldview being pieced back together. One such project is mapping what some call the indigenous sky atlas of the Philippines. This initiative doesn't just restore lost star names, it also seeks to understand how constellations were linked to environmental cycles. It asks, when did the fisher folk know to sail? When did the rain stop? When did the sea turn dangerous? And how were those answers written in the stars? There's a growing push to teach these insights in schools, especially in coastal and indigenous communities. Some educators have started blending Western astronomy with local lore, teaching students both the Big Dipper and the Water Jar, the North Star and Tala. In doing so, they're creating a fuller, more inclusive version of the sky, one that reflects both scientific precision and cultural memory. Because the stars are not just lights, they are history, guidance, and voice. And when we restore their old names, we restore something more, the stories that helped people find their way. not just across the sea, but across time. In a small workshop nestled beneath a tangle of banyan trees, a carpenter runs his fingers over the grain of a newly shaped plank. He isn't just building a boat, he's reviving a vessel from memory. The traditional barangay and vinta boats of the Philippines are more than means of transportation. They are floating expressions of centuries-old engineering, philosophy, and community values. As these vessels are revived today, they serve not only as functional craft, but as cultural archives. Maps, in a sense, shaped by hand. Boat building in the Philippines has long been a sacred and communal affair. In the days before colonial interference, constructing a vessel was not just a technical task, but a ritual. Every curve, joint, and peg held meaning. Knowledge of how to shape the hull to ride monsoon swells, how to align the keel for optimal balance, or how to lace the planks without nails. All of this was passed down orally through observation, practice, and experience. The most famous of these ancient vessels is the barangay, an elegantly crafted plank boat used by early Filipino communities for migration, trade, and warfare. Carbon-dated remains found in Pudon suggest that barangay boats were in use over 1,000 years ago. They featured edge-joined planks, stitched together with natural fiber or pegged with wooden dowels, a technique well suited for the flexing demands of open water. These vessels could be disassembled, repaired, and reassembled, ideal for communities always moving with the sea. Similarly iconic is the vinta, most closely associated with the Samo, Bajo, and Tausug peoples of the Sulu and Mindanao region. With its colorful sail and narrow hull, the vinta was both nimble and visually striking. But beyond aesthetics, its sail design and hull angle were expertly engineered for swift movement between islands, even in strong currents. It was a boat built for archipelagic life, quick to launch, quick to land, and responsive to shifting winds. These boats weren't just vehicles, they were compasses. Their construction mirrored environmental knowledge. The width of the hull was calculated with the monsoon winds in mind. The placement of outriggers reflected expected wave height and stability needs. The choice of wood, often tugas, Philippine teak, or ipil, was based on not just strength, but sound. Boat builders would tap a log and listen. If the tone rang hollow, it was rejected. If it resonated, it became a keel. This intimate relationship between material and purpose extended to ornamentation. Certain carvings served as spiritual protection. Others marked the builder's lineage or acknowledged past journeys. A small shell affixed to the bow might indicate the boat's first safe voyage, while a colored bead lashed near the stern could be a charm for avoiding storms. In this way, boats weren't just tools, they were stories on water. Historians still discuss whether these vessels qualify as maps in a traditional sense. While they didn't depict geography on a surface, they encoded knowledge through form. A vinta's design held information about wind behavior, water conditions, and intended routes. The builder, by shaping the hull a certain way, was expressing a navigational preference, what kinds of currents the boat would favor, what sort of landings it was suited for. One lesser-known practice was the boat dream, a ritual in which a builder would sleep beside the wood before construction began, asking for guidance from ancestors or the spirit of the sea. The dream, interpreted by the builder or a village elder, might suggest design changes, name the boat, or determine the launch day. This blend of craft and intuition meant that no two boats were ever quite the same, even if they followed the same template. Today, traditional boat building is experiencing a revival. In Bertuan, heritage boatwrights are reconstructing barangay vessels using ancient methods. In Tawi-Tawi and Bazalan, elders teach young people how to shape and stitch a vinta, using the same tools and songs their ancestors did. These efforts are more than nostalgic. They are acts of cultural continuity, of proving that the past is not lost, only waiting to be remembered. One fascinating aspect of the revival is the return of sea trial ceremonies. Before a newly built boat is used, it undergoes a test journey, usually accompanied by song, shared food, and symbolic offerings to the water. These trials aren't just about checking seaworthiness, they're about reaffirming the relationship between boat, builder, and sea. They're a statement that the knowledge still flows. Fringe researchers have even proposed that these boats, once fully studied, could be used to reconstruct ancient maritime routes across Southeast Asia. The logic is simple. If a vinta or balangay can still cross certain waters efficiently today, it likely did so centuries ago. Experimental voyages, sometimes called heritage sails, are already taking place to test these theories. One such journey saw a reconstructed balangay sail from the Philippines to Vietnam and back, following no modern navigational tools. The sailors used stars, currents, and traditional chants. They made landfall with accuracy, affirming what indigenous sailors have always known, that the boats themselves carry memory, that their shapes, like shell maps, are forms of recorded wisdom. Even now, in places where traditional boat building has not been formally revived, its traces remain. A canoe built the old way rests beside a tin-roofed hut. A father explains to his child why this curve is different from the motorboats. A scrap of colorful cloth, tied to a beam, flutters in the wind, not forgotten, just waiting. Because these vessels are not relics, they are legacy. They move, they guide, and they remind us that for generations, the ocean was not crossed with tools alone, but with hands, memory, and wood that knew which way the wind would blow. As the revival of traditional navigation continues, so too does the transformation of the shell map from a sacred object of maritime memory into a symbol of cultural resilience. Once dismissed as primitive or decorative, these artifacts are now being reimagined, not just as navigational tools, but as art, as language, and as statements of identity. In this transformation, Filipino shell maps are stepping into museums, classrooms, digital spaces, and perhaps most importantly, into hearts. In recent years, artists across the Philippines have turned to shell maps as a medium for storytelling, using reclaimed wood, beads, wires, and even plastic pollution gathered from beaches. They create contemporary versions of the old forms. These aren't replicas in the traditional sense, rather, they're expressions, evocative pieces that blend ancient structure with modern interpretation. The shells might not mark islands now, but memories. The rods might not trace currents, but histories, disrupted, recovered, retold. One installation in a Davao gallery featured a massive wall-hung shell map crafted from scrap boat materials, with each shell labeled in chalk with a word: storm, safe, hunger, return. The artist explained that it wasn't meant to guide a canoe across water, it was meant to guide the soul through loss and heritage. The piece became a kind of emotional compass, drawing attention to what had been forgotten and why it mattered. In another exhibit in Manila, an interactive display allowed visitors to sail across a projected map by following wave sounds and shifting constellations. At each stop, a story unfolded narrated by community elders, explaining how shell maps once marked not just places but family events, rituals, and survival tales. It became clear that these maps were more than directional tools. They were memory theaters. This reframing isn't limited to galleries. Educators are now incorporating shell maps into curricula as visual learning tools. In a coastal school in northern Palawan, students build their own memory maps, marking significant places in their community with found objects: stones, feathers, shells, string. These are pinned onto driftwood frames, much like traditional maps, but the purpose is different: to help children understand their relationship with space, sea, and story. Historians still debate how closely these contemporary creations resemble their pre-colonial ancestors. Some caution against over-romanticizing or assuming too much about what early maps meant. Others argue that this new use, creative, expressive, and evolving, is part of the tradition itself. After all, shell maps were always more than tools. They were reflections of living, breathing knowledge. Why should that stop now? One lesser-known application of this creative revival is in mental health and memory therapy. In a coastal healing center in Cebu, therapists have begun using shell map crafting as a form of trauma recovery. Patients, often survivors of typhoons, displacement, or family separation, build maps of memory using string and shells. Each item stands in for a feeling, a place, or a turning point. The process, surprisingly effective, mimics the navigational logic of the original maps, finding a way through confusion by recognizing patterns. Digital art spaces are also joining in. Online galleries, NFTs, and virtual museums now feature stylized shell maps, some interactive, others purely visual. One app under development allows users to build their own symbolic shell map, layering memories, photos, and sounds over a digital ocean. It's not traditional navigation, but it echoes the essence, finding your way using what's closest to you. There's a fringe movement as well, among diaspora communities. Filipinos living abroad are creating symbolic shell maps of their displacement, using the form to trace how they moved from island to city, from Manila to Melbourne, from childhood memory to adult identity. For many, these maps are not backward-looking nostalgia, they're tools of integration, a way to see home not as one place, but as a series of remembered crossings. This revival is not without tension. Some elders fear the maps are being abstracted too far, that their sacred meanings are being diluted by metaphor. Others, however, embrace the shift. The shell map was never just about finding a reef. One old navigator told a visiting artist, it was about finding the story in the sea. That story changes, but it's always true. Ultimately, the shell map's contemporary transformation may be its most powerful voyage yet. Once kept private, taught in whispers and inherited in calloused hands, these tools of navigation now stand as open declarations of survival, of artistry, of a culture that never truly forgot. What was once dismissed as useless art is now helping a new generation chart their course. Not always through water, but through identity, memory, and history. They may not all sail by moonlight, or know which wave means what current, but they know that they come from a people who did. And in that knowing, a new kind of navigation begins. Across the archipelago, the sun sets the sea aglow in copper and gold, and as it dips beneath the horizon, one can imagine the ghost of a canoe gliding silently across the water, its hull shaped by memory, its path guided by stars, its map tucked, not in a pocket, but in the very bones of the navigator. This is the quiet conclusion of a long, slow journey, not across islands, but through time. From pre-colonial tradition, to colonial erasure, to contemporary rediscovery, the story of Filipino shell maps has come full circle. Today, the legacy of these maps is no longer confined to driftwood frames or forgotten oral tales. It lives in the fluid relationships between people and sea, in the reverence shown by boat builders who still whisper to planks before shaping them, and in the teachings of elders who remember which shell once meant a turn toward home. The shell map, once seen as a static object, has revealed itself to be something far more dynamic, a living archive of movement. Historians now view Filipino navigation not as a regional curiosity, but as a sophisticated system built upon layers of observation, trial, spirituality, and storytelling. Unlike Western charts, these maps were not designed for mass distribution or conquest. They were personal, communal, and often incomplete by intention, meant to be completed in the mind and heart of the traveler. One of the most profound lessons these maps offer is the importance of impermanence. The sea changes, currents shift, islands erode, and so must the map. That's why Filipino navigators never clung to a single version of a route. They adapted, updated, passed down variations. Knowledge was not sacred because it was fixed. It was sacred because it responded. And perhaps this is what makes shell maps so important today. In a world obsessed with certainty, with GPS precision and concrete borders, these maps remind us that orientation can also come through intuition, story, and trust. That knowing where you are doesn't always mean knowing exact coordinates. It can mean knowing how the wind feels on your face, or how the water sounds as it brushes past the hull. As the shell maps continue to resurface in schools, art, heritage programs, and dreams, they challenge the notion of what counts as knowledge. They make a case for embodied memory, for indigenous epistemology, for ways of learning that don't rely on paper or screen. They insist that to find your way, you sometimes have to lose sight of the chart. And across the Philippines, more and more people are listening. Young navigators trace invisible lines between islands. Artists carve their family history into boats. Grandmothers sing star songs to grandchildren who may never sail, but who now know the stories. Because the shell map was never just about reaching a place. It was about knowing who you are while getting there. And in the gentle quiet of an evening tide, with stars rising like old friends, that lesson still holds. So now, the sea has settled, The stars above the Philippines glow soft and slow, like embers in the sky. The shell map for tonight has done its work. Its lines have curved and uncurved. Its shells have whispered, and its stories have unspooled across 2 hours of tide and time. Breathe in now, not deeply, just gently. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw slacken. Let the rhythm of the waves we've followed rock you back into your body. Not as a sailor this time, but as a sleeper. You've journeyed far, but without leaving your room, through archipelagos of memory, across oceans of knowledge, between islands that may not be on any paper chart but are always there, inside the ones who remember. There are no storms now, no currents pulling at your thoughts, no questions needing answers, just the slow hush of sea meeting shore. A reminder that all maps eventually lead back to rest. So drift a little. Let the darkness soften around the edges. Imagine that canoe again, its bow slicing through starlight. You're not steering anymore, you're just watching, listening, letting the boat carry you. And if your mind begins to wander, that's okay. It's just following another current. Let it go. The map knows the way. It always has.